There are stories not written in ink, but in memory, preserved in the echoes of time, where the sea once swallowed radiant cities, a civilization vanished from human memory. When the great flood struck, the rising waves consumed the plains, and monumental structures faded into shadows within our collective memory. The old world collapsed, leaving behind only fragments of a glorious era that existed long before official history began. Before the Egyptian pyramids and the cuneiform lines of Mesopotamia, the ancient people of India spoke of a golden age. They did not call it a myth, they called it memory. In sacred verses, the gods themselves once walked upon the earth. It was the age of the yugas, cycles of light and shadow, when even the waters could swallow an entire world. Today, all that remains are passages in the Rigveda, legends of Dwarka lost beneath the sea, and faint traces of forgotten ruins. Yet the question lingers. What truly happened to the age of the gods? Was the Great Flood just a legend, or a buried memory? This journey is not about proving, but about listening. Not to conclude, but to open doors long sealed by dust. Let history speak for itself, slowly, softly, the way time always whispers to those willing to hear. Lunora, where the past speaks in a voice softer than night. When we look back at human history, there is an invisible line often used to separate history from prehistory. Everything before written records is usually swept into one broad category: mythology. But in truth, what humanity has passed down through thousands of years is not just imagined stories. Hidden between the lines of legends lies a fragment of memory, distorted, buried, but still there, like embers that have not gone out. The ancient people of India, from a very early time, preserved these memories through sacred hymns, epic tales, and verses carried by the human voice across generations. Not through simple writing, but through the rhythm and breath of time itself. When archaeologists began uncovering ancient ruins along the coast of India, a quiet question started to rise. Could there have been a civilization that existed before what official history calls the beginning of civilization? While we often refer to milestones like Mesopotamia around the year 3100 before the Common Era, or ancient Egypt around the year 3000 before the Common Era, the ancient texts of ancient India speak of cycles lasting tens of thousands of years, of brilliant kingdoms that vanished, of gods who once walked the earth, and of a great flood that swept everything away. What makes the way the ancient Indians told their stories unique is how they saw time. Not as a straight line, but as spirals. Each spiral was an era called a yuga, and the yugas followed one another in endless cosmic cycles. Within this turning wheel was an age called Satya Yuga, a golden age, a time of order, light, and perfect harmony. But then, as the hymns tell it, when human hearts began to change and the powerful started to fight for dominance, the world slowly slipped into darker ages: Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and finally Kali Yuga, the age of chaos, the very age in which humanity now lives. This was not a poetic metaphor about morality. For them, it was real history, a history buried beneath thousands of years of ocean water and the dust of time. When underwater ruins were uncovered along the coast of Gujarat, many questions became difficult to ignore. What is now nothing more than submerged stones and fading outlines was once called Dwarka in the ancient texts, a glorious city linked to the name Krishna. For generations, people dismissed it as myth. But when sonar surveys revealed vast underwater structures, those seemingly fantastical stories began to take on a very different tone. Though archaeologists continue to debate, the overlap between the names in the sacred texts and the real locations beneath the waves is not easy to look away from. What's striking is that in sacred hymns like the Rig Veda, the oldest known text of India, there are passages describing royal dynasties that lasted thousands, even tens of thousands of years. The Devas and Asuras, gods and demigods, are not portrayed as vague symbols. They speak, act, wage wars, form alliances, much like members of a structured society. According to Indian tradition, the time during which these gods ruled the earth stretches over hundreds of thousands of years, a timeline far beyond anything accepted by mainstream history. It's easy to dismiss these stories as sacred myths invented to explain the world. But when you set them beside the Greek legend of Atlantis, the flood memories in the Epic of Gilgamesh of the Sumerians, or the Great Flood in Genesis, something uncanny emerges. Across cultures, separated by oceans, there are fragments of a shared memory, echoes of a golden age before the world was drowned by water. These fragments don't align perfectly, but they resonate like distant voices from the same forgotten storm. When we look at this, it becomes harder to draw a clean line between history and mythology. Perhaps what we call the beginning of civilization is really just chapter 2 or 3 of a much longer story. Perhaps part of humanity's history was once written in another language. The language of those who lived through ages we can now only imagine. Time has a peculiar habit. It does not destroy memory completely. It simply covers it with layers of dust, water, and collective forgetting. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes. Fragile, distant, but never silent. And from those echoes begins the journey to search for the age of the gods. If there is a place where time is remembered not through stone or paper, but through words, it is in the sacred hymns of the Rig Veda, one of the oldest surviving texts in human history. In these verses, the center is not kings or dynasties, but gods and worlds that have passed away. The Rig Veda does not describe a primitive age when humankind was just learning to make fire. It speaks of a world already shaped, with order, with laws, with light and darkness, with war and peace, and with conversations between gods and humans. These are not the words of a people just beginning to find their place in the world. They are the words of those who looked back at the past as if gazing upon a lost legacy. The Vedic hymns were passed down orally through countless generations before they were written in ancient Sanskrit. What stands out is their remarkable stability over thousands of years. The ancient Indians believed that every syllable in the Rig Veda held a form of power, a vibration connected to the cosmos. That is why Vedic priests memorized every line, every rhythm, every breath, not just to remember, but to preserve the spiritual state of that memory. When we read the Rig Veda today, we are not simply reading an old text. We are listening to the echoes of people who lived thousands of years before us. In many passages, the Rig Veda does not portray gods as distant beings. Gods like Indra, Varuna, and Agni walk in worlds where humans are also present. There are verses describing battles between the Devas and Asuras as if they were historical memories rather than mythical stories. Golden temples, radiant cities, sacred rivers flowing through vast plains. It is no coincidence that modern linguists called the Rig Veda a window into prehistory, a text that seems to speak of a civilization that reached a certain level of development, then vanished, leaving behind only the soft whisper of songs. When the Rig Veda is connected with the Mahabharata, i.e. the massive epic that recounts great upheavals, the picture becomes clearer. The Mahabharata is not simply a story of heroes and gods. It feels like a collective memory told through the language of epic poetry, long dynasties, great wars, prophecies, kings of divine bloodlines, weapons blazing like falling stars. The level of detail is so striking that many find it difficult to see it as mere legend. In one passage, the Mahabharata describes a weapon as the light of 1,000 suns, a haunting, powerful image that seems far beyond the imagination of a simple, early society. And yet, what may be even more striking than the gods or the wars is how these two texts speak about time. There is no clear concept of a beginning of history. Instead, history is shown as an endless cycle in which brilliant civilizations can be swallowed and then reborn. Time does not end, it only changes form. The gods do not disappear, they step back behind a veil, leaving the world for humankind to continue the story. This worldview is what makes the Rig Veda and Mahabharata rare records that hint at the possible existence of civilizations before the flood. One often overlooked detail is how closely these hymns are tied to nature. They speak of rivers like the Sarasvati River, a great river once described as the mother of all waters, long gone now. When archaeologists discovered ancient dry riverbeds matching Sarasvati's location, the story came alive again. Sarasvati was not just a spiritual symbol, it once existed and nourished a thriving culture. And what about the cities they described? Could what we now call myth simply be memory buried under time? Centuries before Western historians drew a line between history and legend, the ancient Indians lived in a world where these two flowed together like a river meeting the sea. They did not try to prove their stories with artifacts, they simply told them. And because of that, what they passed down was not bound by the frameworks of official history. It opened doors to other possibilities, to other layers of time, to civilizations we have never truly faced. There is a strange power in stories preserved for thousands of years. When we read them, the words carry more than meaning. They carry an echo. It does not shout. It does not force. It gently stirs something inside, reminding us that behind those words lies something larger, a collective memory buried beneath centuries of dust. And perhaps it is through these hymns that the first fragments of a pre-flood civilization begin to emerge. Not as a complete map, but like distant stars scattered across a night sky. Faint, separate, but when connected, forming a constellation. Those voices have never truly disappeared. They have only waited for someone willing to listen. And as people begin weaving together the Rig Veda, the Mahabharata, and modern archaeological discoveries, those ancient echoes slowly grow clearer, like a door softly opening toward an age that official history has never written down. If our modern civilization is used to seeing time as a straight line, with a beginning and an end, the ancient world of India saw it as a spiral that never stops turning. For them, history was not a chain of events leading up to the present. It was the changing seasons of the cosmos. An age is born, grows, fades away, and is reborn again, like a river flowing from the mountains to the sea, and then returning to the sky as rain. This vision gave birth to the concept of the yugas, one of the most ancient and profound models of cosmic history ever conceived. In ancient Indian philosophy, there are four main yugas: Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. Each yuga is seen as a distinct age with its own order, morality, and structure. And most importantly, each one lasts thousands or even tens of thousands of years. According to ancient texts, a full cycle called Mahayuga spans more than 4.3 million years. To the modern mind, that number sounds unbelievable, but to those who lived within this worldview, it was not a metaphor, it was cosmic reality. In Satya Yuga, the first age, the world is described as a perfect era. Morality, knowledge, and harmony fill every corner. There is no conflict, no war, no separation between humans and gods. People, according to the hymns, lived longer, understood more deeply, and were profoundly connected to nature. It was a golden age, the same kind of age that many civilizations across the world remember by different names: the Golden Age, Atlantis, the Age of the Gods. When modern scholars compare these stories, they notice a striking pattern. Across distant cultures, people speak of a radiant era that came before a great catastrophe. After Satya Yuga, the world moves into Treta Yuga. This is when morality begins to decline, when differences and ambitions grow. Many traditions say this is the time when the gods no longer walked among humans as before, appearing only through rituals and visions. Knowledge still shines brightly, but power becomes something that can be taken, contested, and fought over. Treta Yuga is also the age when legendary kingdoms are said to have risen, cities described as far more magnificent than any known urban model of the ancient world. Next comes Dvapara Yuga, the age of transition between light and shadow. This is when conflicts intensify, wars between devas and asuras spread, and dynasties begin to weaken. In many passages of the Mahabharata, battles are described as vast, almost unimaginable wars with flying chariots and light like falling stars. There is no scientific proof that these descriptions are literal physical events, but what is undeniable is that they follow a coherent historical structure. These are not scattered short tales, they form a continuous timeline. And finally comes Kali Yuga, the age we live in. In ancient texts, Kali Yuga is not an apocalypse. It is the age of spiritual darkness. Human lives are shorter, faith is uncertain, morality erodes, and the distance between the soul and the cosmos grows wider. It is the era in which ancient knowledge has become fragments covered by countless layers of forgetting. That is why, to the ancient Indians, the past does not lie behind us. It lies beneath us, like a deep memory waiting to be awakened. The power of the Yuga concept does not come from the millions of years it describes, but from how it places humanity inside something far larger than itself. Within that great spiral, every civilization is just one chapter in a massive book. When one chapter ends, another begins. And what we call the end is merely a pause. When the idea of the Yugas is placed alongside other mythic cycles of history, like the Greek Golden Age and Iron Age, or the Mesoamerican concept of the four suns, the similarities are remarkable. Many cultures with no direct contact describe history as a sequence of rising and falling ages. This raises a larger question. Is this just a symbolic spiritual model, or does it reflect a collective memory of real cycles of civilization that once existed? As modern science begins to reveal evidence of massive geological upheavals near the end of the Ice Age, around 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, these dates align closely with global flood legends from many cultures. And if the Indian traditions also speak of a golden age ending in a flood, could this be the memory of a shared global event? Could Satya Yuga be another name for a time when humanity once rose to a level of civilization far beyond what we understand today? People often think of myths as nothing more than imaginary stories, but in reality, most ancient civilizations never drew a clear line between history and mythology. What modern people call legend was, to them, simply the past. Within that worldview, stories of gods walking the earth were not literary metaphors. They were memories that had been made sacred. For the ancient Indians, eras like Satya Yuga were not fantasies. They were distant realities. This becomes clear in the way the Indians preserved their epics and scriptures. For thousands of years before writing became widespread, stories were safeguarded through strict oral traditions so precise that not even a single syllable was allowed to change. Those who carried these epics were not storytellers improvising for an audience. They were guardians of sacred memory. The Vedic priests keepers of the hymns, believed that every word held a form of cosmic energy, a link in a chain of memory stretching from the age of the gods to the age of humankind. They did not create. They recalled. If we look closely, we can see a repeating pattern across many cultures, a memory of a golden age, a time of gods or higher beings, a great catastrophic event that made the old world vanish, and survivors passing those stories down to the next generations. Greece has its myths of the gods on Mount Olympus and the age of the Titans. Mesopotamia has the epic of Gilgamesh and its story of the Great Flood. Mesoamerica speaks of suns dying and being reborn. India tells of the Yugas and the age when the Devas walked among humanity. These striking similarities, despite coming from lands separated by thousands of miles, have led many to ask, was there a shared event behind these myths? A global memory told in many different languages and symbols? Myth has a resilience that writing does not. When an empire collapses, texts can burn, temples can crumble, and knowledge can be buried beneath the sands. But a story, if it runs deep enough, will live on in human memory. It may change shape, but its core remains, like a seed lying dormant in the soil, waiting to sprout again. This is how the memory of a pre-flood world might have survived, not in official chronicles, but in whispered stories passed through generations. A remarkable aspect of Indian mythology is the way these stories merge humans and gods, real geography and mythic realms. Cities like Dwarka or Ayodhya are not told as distant heavens. They are described as real places, with rivers, roads, and shining palaces. The storytellers never say they imagined these places. They tell their stories as if they remembered them. When underwater archaeological discoveries off the coast of Gujarat revealed structures resembling the descriptions of Dwarka, it became clear. The boundary between myth and history is not always as sharp as we imagine. Myth is also how humans wrap memory in symbols. When something too vast, too mysterious, or too painful happens, like a great flood, it cannot be recorded with mathematical precision. Instead, it becomes a symbolic story, easy to remember, easy to pass on. In those stories, gods may represent forces of nature, ancient civilizations, or powers once known to humankind. But the most important thing is this: they did not forget. That is why the hymns, epics, and ancient myths of India carry a very different resonance from later Western mythology. They are not simply meant to explain something like the origin of a people. They feel like streams of memory flowing from a lost world, a world the storytellers never saw themselves but felt through echoes handed down across time. And in this way, mythology achieved what no library, no empire, no wall of stone ever could. It carried the memory of an age through every ruin. In those stories, the pre-flood world never truly vanished. It only changed its form, from a living reality to an echo. And perhaps if we listen closely enough, those echoes might hold the first clues leading back to the age of the gods. In the mythic memory of ancient India, there was once a time when the world needed no laws because order lived within every breath of human life. That time was Satya Yuga, the first of the 4 yugas, known by many names: the age of truth, the golden age, and the age when gods and humans coexisted. It was not an age of empires or conquest, but an age of harmony between human and human, between humans and nature, and between humanity and the cosmos. In the ancient hymns, Satya Yuga is described as a time when people lived long lives, not because of advanced medicine, but because their spiritual and physical selves were one. They were said to sense the laws of nature deeply, not through theory, but through living intuition. People did not say they believed in the gods. They saw them. They did not pray in darkness. They spoke in the light. The world had no gap between the visible and the invisible, between matter and spirit. The central idea of this era was Dharma, the cosmic order that governs everything in balance. In Indian tradition, Dharma during Satya Yuga was like a four-legged throne, perfectly stable, unshaken. All living beings followed this natural flow without force or control. There was no greed, no war, no concept of mine and yours. Humans were not just living in nature, they were a part of it, like rivers with the sea, like wind with the sky. That is why this era became more than a memory of the past. It became a symbol of longing, a vision of a world without division. What's fascinating is that this image of a golden age isn't unique to India. Ancient Greece spoke of a golden age when people lived close to the gods without war or laws. Mesopotamia told of an age before the Great Flood when gods ruled alongside humans. Mesoamerica spoke of a first era when the world was pure. These echoes across cultures raise a striking question. Were they all remembering the same thing? Descriptions of Satya Yuga often portray a world free of walls, weapons, and control. People didn't build cities to defend against one another. They built sacred spaces to live in harmony with nature. Many Indian scholars believe the earliest idea of temples comes from this time, not as places to worship distant powers, but as spaces to reconnect with cosmic balance. The gods of this era were not distant kings. They were companions, teachers, pure manifestations of natural laws. In this period, society was said to have no divisions or castes. There were no nobles or peasants, no kings or subjects. Communities functioned through resonance rather than competition. There was no desire to hoard wealth because everything was considered the shared gift of nature. This idea feels foreign to the modern world where everything has a price and ownership defines power. But to the ancients, ownership itself was strange, even illogical. No one could own land, water, or light. They simply lived under the generosity of land, water, and light. One of the most powerful symbols of this age was light. Not just physical light, but the light of knowledge, jnana. Ancient Indians believed that in Satya Yuga people didn't need to be taught right from wrong, because that light already lived within them. When that light began to dim, Treta Yuga began. But in the collective memory of generations, Satya Yuga never completely disappeared. It became a spiritual archetype, a lost paradise people continued to remember and long for. Even though Satya Yuga lies beyond the reach of conventional archaeological evidence, its idea remains vivid in the Indian cultural consciousness. The oldest temples are not tied to gods of war or power, but to forces tied to life itself: water, fire, the sun, earth, and wind. These were the elements that formed the world and the companions of humanity in its golden age, not things to conquer, but to live alongside. When a radiant era like Satya Yuga is told and retold for thousands of years, it becomes more than memory. It becomes part of cultural identity, a reference point against which the present is measured. The ancient Indians believed that when society fell into chaos, the memory of Satya Yuga would serve as a lantern in the dark, reminding humanity that there was once a better time, a time not ruled by power, but by harmony. If the era of Satya Yuga was known to the ancient Indians as the Age of Truth, then the lives of those remembered in that distant time did not revolve around power or wealth, but around something far more serene: unity. It was a society without fragmentation. People were not isolated individuals searching for meaning, but threads woven into a vast and living web where every creature, every breeze, every ray of light, and every drop of water had its place and purpose. According to the hymns, those who lived in this age did not need enforced laws because they had dharma, not as a written code, but as an inner, natural state. They felt right and wrong the way they felt their own breath. No one needed to be taught to live in harmony. It was their nature to do so. The spiritual world and the material world were not split in two, as in modern society. Every action was part of a greater dance, Urta, the cosmic order that holds everything together. In that understanding, religion was not a system of doctrine, it was a way of life. Notably, many ancient texts do not depict Satya Yuga with grand monuments. There were no marble cities, no towering fortresses, no golden chariots. Instead, the recurring images are of open fields, clear rivers, sunlight, and soft winds. This shows that the memory of Satya Yuga is not tied to material strength, but to spiritual harmony, something humanity, no matter how many cities it builds, has never fully been able to recreate. In that society, knowledge did not live in books, but in how people observed the world. Those who lived in Satya Yuga, according to Indian tradition, had a natural understanding of the laws that shape the heavens and the earth. They didn't invent astronomy, they lived it. They didn't study the changing of seasons, they felt it in the breathing of the land. Knowledge was not used to control nature, but to live in rhythm with it. This knowledge later became the seed for what Indians call Vidya, sacred wisdom. Many disciplines, Ayurveda, ancient medicine, Jyotish, astrology, and astronomy, yoga, the path of body-spirit union, Sankhya, cosmic philosophy, are said to have originated as echoes of Satya Yuga. Even though these systems were only recorded later, many Indians believe they were never truly invented, only rediscovered, remembered from a time when they were simply part of daily existence. Spiritual life in this era was also free from the elaborate rituals and power hierarchies of later religions. There was no priestly class that controlled belief. Each person was said to have a direct connection to the divine, no intermediaries needed. The ancient Indians described Satya Yuga as a time when people did not pray to ask for blessings, but spoke to the gods as to old friends. Prayers were not cries for help, they were words of gratitude. The gods were not distant figures in the sky, but presences in the fire, the rivers, the wind, and the morning light. The understanding of life and death during this age was also profoundly different. People did not fear death because it was not seen as the end. They believed the soul was part of the cosmic flow, returning to the whole after leaving the body. This was not a formalized religion as we know it today. It was a deep, instinctive knowing. Without the fear of death, there was no frantic grasping for life, no hunger for power, no anxious hoarding of wealth. This inner stillness made Satya Yuga a symbol of a world without inner conflict. Interestingly, some modern scholars have compared the vision of Satya Yuga to the egalitarian harmony found in anthropological studies of early human societies, communities without rigid social hierarchies, without large-scale warfare, living in rhythm with natural cycles. But what makes Satya Yuga unique is that it is remembered not as a local community, but as an entire world, a global state in which all humanity lived in harmony. Of course, some may say this is only a romanticized vision of the past, but its power does not lie in whether it can be proven archaeologically. Its strength lies in the way this memory has endured for thousands of years, woven into the fabric of Indian culture. For them, Satya Yuga is not just a lost era. It is a spiritual horizon, an ideal that each new age looks back to whenever the world falls into chaos. No golden age lasts forever. In the cosmic memory of ancient India, the light of Satya Yuga did not end with thunder or war. It faded slowly, like the last rays of sunlight withdrawing from a rooftop, like warmth dissolving from the water as night arrives. And it was in that quiet fading that Treta Yuga began. The ancient Indians believed that when Satya Yuga came to an end, something subtle changed in human nature. The innate light of wisdom receded, leaving a fragile distance between humanity and the cosmos. People still lived in the light, but they were no longer fully a part of it. They began to feel separate from the natural world. From that feeling of separation came the idea of I and the other. And from that point, a chain of irreversible changes was set in motion. In Treta Yuga, humanity still carried much of the memory of the previous age. People still knew how to live in harmony, still felt connected to the gods, still could listen to nature. But what was lost was total unity. Dharma, the cosmic order, no longer stood on 4 legs as it had before. It leaned, standing only on 3. What was once instinct now needed to be remembered. What was once natural now had to be taught. And so, from a society that needed no rules, humans began creating them, not to control each other, but to fill the gap left by what had been lost. It was also during this time, according to the hymns, that the gods no longer walked among humans as they once did. They did not vanish, they stepped behind the veil. They appeared only in sacred moments, in rituals, in dreams, in the wind and light. The material world and the spiritual world separated into 2 layers, still connected, but no longer one. This was the turning point, the shift from the world of the gods to the world of humans, guided by the gods. This separation had profound consequences. As trust in intuition weakened, people began to seek spiritual guides. This was the birth of early forms of religion, not as institutions of power, but as bridges. Sages, those who still felt the cosmic current clearly, became intermediaries between humanity and the divine. They were not kings or teachers in the modern sense. They were keepers of memory, helping their communities remember how to listen to the voices beyond the veil. Treta Yuga is also tied to the rise of the first kingdoms. Tradition holds that this was when structured societies emerged, leaders, workers, keepers of knowledge, and protectors of communities. This did not begin from ambition or conquest, at least not at first. It began because people no longer had the ability to live as one unified whole. Social hierarchy appeared because natural harmony had cracked. In that sense, with the dimming of Satya Yuga's perfect light, the first foundations of politics were born. From this point forward, knowledge was no longer something everyone carried equally. It became something to be preserved, passed through hymns, rituals, and sacred lineages. Part of it remained open to the community, but another part became specialized, held by those who could still access the other world. The gap between those who knew and those who did not began to grow. This was one of the earliest fractures that would shape everything to come. Alongside these social shifts, human psychology also changed. When the gods were no longer beside them, fear arose, not fear of war or death, but a quiet fear of distance. People began to pray, not just to give thanks, but to be heard again. They built sacred places, no longer just open spaces in nature, but concentrated points of energy where they believed the gods could hear their voices. These were the first steps toward temple culture in ancient India, and as spiritual light faded, material desire was born. For the first time, the concepts of mine and yours gained weight. What once belonged to everyone became objects of ownership. Rivers, land, harvests began to be divided. At first, these divisions were practical and to organize society, but within them lay the seed of future conflict. In the Indian view of history, humanity did not begin with violence. It began with a small crack in consciousness. All these changes did not happen overnight. They unfolded over thousands of years, like the sun shifting slowly from morning to afternoon. Treta Yuga was not an age of darkness, but of slanted light. It was still bright, but no longer pure, like a familiar song with a single note out of tune. And from that note, the music of history began to gain new chords. When Treta Yuga unfolded, the world was no longer a smooth, seamless silk like it had been in Satya Yuga. On that once flat fabric, the first folds began to appear, the earliest kingdoms, the first sacred centers, and the first forms of power in human memory. Humanity had stepped out of its state of oneness with the cosmos and began to shape life through structure, no longer guided solely by instinct, but by deliberate order. Ancient texts describe Treta Yuga as the era of social archetypes. It is no coincidence that many of India's most important myths, including the events of the Ramayana, are set in this time. This was the age when power, though not yet oppressive, became a recognized concept. Every community had people believed to have a stronger connection with the cosmos, and these individuals gradually became spiritual leaders, then political ones. In the beginning, power was not for domination, it was for preserving order. A leader was seen as a pillar of the community, like a single lamp glowing in a dark room. They were believed to remember more clearly the teachings of Satya Yuga, to hear the voices of the divine more deeply. Their role was not to rule by force, but to guide. But as power began to concentrate, something inevitable followed: distance. The first distance was not between kings and commoners, but between those who knew and those who did not. Knowledge that once belonged to everyone began to be held by a smaller group. They became the keepers, the rememberers, the interpreters. In Indian culture, they were the rishis, sages, the ones who heard the sound of the universe and passed it down through sacred chants. These voices would later crystallize into the Vedas, but in Treta Yuga they existed primarily through oral tradition, ritual, and the sacred power of sound. Once knowledge had guardians, religion, or more accurately, structured belief, began to form. Places that had once been wild and sacred became ceremonial spaces, stone circles, sacred pillars, gathering grounds where people would listen to the voice of the ritual leader. No one called them temples yet, but these were the nuclei from which the first cities would emerge. Alongside religion came kingship. As communities grew, they needed more centralized coordination. A single leader with great spiritual authority could organize agricultural rituals, guide survival decisions, and distribute resources. And so the idea of the Raja, the king, was born. In Treta Yuga, kings were not seen as rulers above all. They were believed to be entrusted by the gods to watch over the world. Many scholars have noted something fascinating. In Indian mythology, kings of this period often had a close, almost personal relationship with the gods. It was not the relationship of mortals to distant deities, but of partners working together. In ancient coronation rituals, a king received authority not just from his people, but from the gods, through sacred rites. This created a dual system, power legitimized both by human consent and cosmic faith. As societies expanded, another phenomenon emerged: stratification. In Satya Yuga, everyone lived in harmony without hierarchy. But as Treta Yuga advanced, social functions became more defined. There were leaders, protectors, farmers, and keepers of ritual. This was the earliest form of the social classes that would later shape ancient Indian civilization. At first, it was not about superiority, it was about function, so society could operate smoothly. However, once power and hierarchy existed, they opened the door to something Satya Yuga had never known: ambition. When one person could hold more power than another, imbalance became possible. Myths from this era describe the first conflicts, not large-scale wars like in later ages, but small clashes between early kingdoms, between those who wanted to preserve the old harmony and those who began to desire more. Spiritually, Treta Yuga was still an age when the gods were strongly present. But instead of walking beside humans, they began to manifest through intermediaries. They appeared in dreams, sacred flames, beams of light, and through chosen individuals. Worship became more formal, and rituals more elaborate. People no longer felt the gods as near as before, and so the need for places of worship began to grow. From this era came the earliest spiritual structures, not the towering stone temples of later centuries, but earthen, wooden, and simple stone sanctuaries, rich with sacred meaning. These places were not built merely for prayer, they were attempts to hold on to a piece of the fading light of Satya Yuga. As the gods withdrew behind the veil, humans built their own veil, trying to reach across to the other side. From these first steps, spiritual centers and political centers were born. And from those centers grew the earliest city-states, the first kingdoms, and eventually the great civilizations of the post-Diluvian world. When the light of Satya Yuga became nothing more than a shimmering memory in the human soul, humanity stepped deeper into the age of Treta Yuga, a world where the sacred still existed but no longer revealed itself as it once had. By then, human society had taken on a more defined shape, no longer communities fully merged with nature, but ordered structures with leaders, knowledge keepers, sacred places to connect with the divine, and the first faint lines dividing what belongs to all from what belongs to one. Communities in Treta Yuga were no longer entirely nomadic as they were in the remembered Golden Age. People began settling around great bodies of water, rivers and lakes, places that were still seen as doorways to the divine. In ancient Indian thought, water was more than sustenance for the body. It was the current of cosmic memory. The earliest rituals of this era took place by the riverbank, where people offered water, lit fires, and sang prayers to remind themselves that the gods were still there, even if distant. Rituals were no longer simple whispers to the wind, as in Satya Yuga. They became structured. There was a ritual leader, there were participants, and there were fixed cycles of time. Each ceremony was not just an act of devotion, but a way to bind the community together. Through ritual, they didn't only speak to the gods. They reminded one another of a time when there had been no wall between humans and the divine. Sound held a special power in these rites. The ancient Indians believed the universe was born from a primordial sound, Om, and therefore sound was also the pathway back to the source. In Treta Yuga, chants, drum beats, flutes, and the humming of sacred syllables were seen as keys that could open the door to the other side. Many verses later recorded in the Rig Veda may have their roots in these ancient chants, not as newly composed texts, but as lingering echoes of a collective memory. It was during this time that sacred architecture began to take shape. People built living mandalas, ceremonial circles made of stone, earth, or wood. At the center, there was often a sacred fire, the symbol of the gods, of the light of wisdom that had faded but not disappeared. These circles were not just places of ritual, they were reflections of how people saw the cosmos as a cycle in which humanity lived within the circle, not above or outside it. Many modern archaeologists have noted striking similarities among ancient stone circles around the world, even between cultures separated by thousands of miles and millennia. Some suggest these shared patterns may be the remnants of a pre-flood cultural memory. As communities grew, sacred sites became fixed centers, places where people gathered at special times of the year. Festivals tied to natural cycles emerged, the seasons of planting, harvest, the full moon, the equinoxes. These were seen as moments when the other world drew closer. In those moments, the entire community entered a space between human and divine, between present reality and ancient memory. Alongside ritual came clearer social stratification. The role of the ritual keepers, the early rishis and Brahmins, became increasingly central. They were not only transmitters of sacred words, but keepers of rhythm, holders of knowledge about time, the seasons, health, and the movement of the stars. Society began to run on concentrated knowledge, and a major shift from Satya Yuga, when understanding flowed through everyone equally. On a psychological level, Treta Yuga saw the birth of a deep fear, the fear of forgetting. With the gods no longer directly present, people feared that without ritual, without memory, the connection would vanish. Every ceremony became not just a prayer, but an act of preservation, a way to keep cosmic memory alive. This is why ancient Indian traditions hold such precision in their recitations, syllables, and timing. To lose a single note was to lose a fragment of the universe's memory. Another profound shift of Treta Yuga was the expansion of the concept of sacred space. In Satya Yuga, everything was sacred because everything was connected. But as distance formed, people began to separate sacred space from ordinary space. Temples, ceremonial rings, sacred rivers, sacred trees, these became the centers of communal life. Humans no longer lived within the sacred world. They went to the sacred world. It was a quiet but monumental change in collective consciousness. And from this separation, a new layer of society emerged, those who guarded sacred places, those who served the rituals, those who led spiritually, and those who labored. This was the earliest shape of India's caste-like structure. At first, it wasn't oppressive. It was a natural way to organize society. But it also laid the foundation for power to eventually rise and concentrate in ways Satya Yuga had never known. Rivers continued to be the lifelines of the world during this age. In ancient thought, a river did more than nourish the body. It connected humankind to the divine. For that reason, many early centers of kingship and worship were built along riverbanks where the flowing water was seen as the breath of the universe. This tradition would later echo in the memory of the Sarasvati River and the Ganga River, both revered as mothers in Indian culture. But in Treta Yuga, these rivers were not yet symbols, they were living beings, the beating hearts of political, spiritual, and cultural life. The first kingdoms began to expand their territories. At first, boundaries were just sacred zones near water sources. Over time, they grew into stable, organized settlements. The leader was no longer only a spiritual guide. He became the manager of resources, the coordinator of production, the distributor of food, the protector of his people. The concept of the Raja, the king, began to carry many layers of meaning, a being entrusted by the divine, yet one who also held real authority. This was the first moment in Indian memory when politics and religion became one. Sacred centers grew larger as well. From simple circles of stone or earth, people began building permanent structures, not only to pray, but to preserve memory itself. The earliest temples are believed to have been modeled on the mandala, a recreation of the cosmos in physical form. At the center burned the sacred fire, the symbol of divine light, surrounded by rings for ceremony and spaces for ritual keepers. This structure would later become the foundation of Indian temple architecture, enduring for thousands of years. Music and sacred sound continued to play a central role in social and spiritual life. Ancient chants, once simple bridges to the divine, evolved into the foundation of a complex ritual system. The keepers of knowledge, the rishis, became a distinct class entrusted with interpreting and conveying the will of the gods. To the people, their words carried the weight of law, for they spoke not only for the community, but also for the world beyond the veil. Though they were not kings, this priestly class held immense influence. A stable social hierarchy gradually took shape. At the top were the kings and sages, below them the warriors who defended the realm, next the farmers and artisans, and finally those who served in rituals or performed humbler tasks. It is important to note that in the early Treta Yuga, this structure was not yet oppressive. It was seen as harmonious, each person fulfilling their role within the whole. Yet even in that harmony, the seeds of inequality and power struggle began to quietly grow. Psychologically, this transformation left a lasting mark on humanity. When the gods no longer walked among them and power no longer belonged to everyone, people began to see one another differently. They were no longer children of the same river, but people of a kingdom, people of a temple. The idea of community slowly turned into the idea of territory and authority. And once territory existed, conflict became inevitable. The earliest legends of mythic wars likely emerged from this very era. Not wars of modern imagination, no great machines or cataclysmic weapons, but struggles over land, faith, and control of water, the most sacred resource of all. In stories of ancient heroes, two forces always moved side by side, the holy light of ritual and the dark shadow of ambition. Interestingly, many other ancient traditions, from Mesopotamia to Greece, speak of a similar semi-mythic age when gods, kings, and heroes coexisted in history. The Ramayana, too, is set in Treta Yuga, filled with beings who are both divine and human. This suggests that Treta Yuga was the era when history and mythology were still one, a time when what we now call ancient civilizations were not yet distant relics but living memories. Along the sacred rivers, the first trade routes began to form. They weren't grand highways like those of later empires, but natural corridors, waterways, narrow mountain paths, and ceremonial harbors where fleets gathered during special times of the year. In many traditional accounts, the full moons and solstices were seen as open gates, moments when the borders between sacred kingdoms softened, allowing people to trade, offer rituals, and hold inter-realm ceremonial gatherings. From these meetings, alliances slowly emerged. They were not only forged to avoid war, but also to maintain balance, a core concept in ancient Indian philosophy. If one kingdom grew too strong, the cosmic scale would tip. To preserve harmony, sacred pacts were made, ceremonial alliances, marriage bonds between clans, and divine covenants. Every word of these oaths was believed to carry the weight of cosmic law. To break them was not only to betray humans, but to defy the very order of the universe itself. One of the clearest signs of this interconnected world was the unification of sacred language and ritual. Though each region spoke its own tongue, the great ceremonies shared a common system of sacred sounds, ancient syllables that would later crystallize in the Vedas. This borderless language allowed kingdoms to communicate, perform joint rituals, and strengthen a shared identity that transcended territorial lines. The rishis, keepers of knowledge, traveled between lands as spiritual envoys, carrying not only sacred hymns but also news, stories, and knowledge of the wider world. From these early ritual centers, sacred city-states were born. They were more than just settlements, they were memory stations, places where trade routes, religious rites, politics, and ceremony converged. A city-state might not have been vast in size, but if it sat at the crossroads of river networks or pilgrimage paths, it could become a powerful center. Later traditions would echo their memory in stories of cities of the gods, radiant places that existed before the Great Flood. Many modern scholars have asked why so many ancient civilizations, from Mesopotamia and Egypt to the Indus Valley and Mesoamerica, share images of river-based power centers, common ritual practices, and early trade networks that predate recorded history. Perhaps this is not coincidence, but a faint imprint of a global pre-flood era, an era Treta Yuga may have been a part of. The alliances between kingdoms did more than enable exchange. They formed a rotating network of spiritual power. In many rituals, kings and sages from different lands gathered together, not to conquer, but to maintain the cosmic balance. This was a time when politics and spirituality were still intertwined, not separate as they are in the modern world. Ancient hymns describe these meetings as light encircling the riverbanks with sacred fires burning through the night, and chants echoing under a star-filled sky. At the same time, a new class of merchants and intermediaries arose. They were not merchants in the modern sense seeking wealth, but carriers of goods, rituals, and messages between kingdoms. They helped spread rituals, symbols, and shared cosmological ideas across distant lands. In many Indian traditions, this group is remembered as those who travel upon the water, people who belonged to no single land but were the threads that tied everything together. But as the network expanded, so did its hidden tensions. Some kingdoms became wealthier. Some sacred centers gained greater prestige. These differences, at first natural, slowly became sources of rivalry. When power could flow along rivers, it could also be taken. And from within sacred rituals, the earliest calculations of realpolitik began to take root. In many ancient Indian traditions, this period is described as the age when kings ruled, but the sages guided. The rishis commanded no armies and held no land, yet their voices carried farther than any fortress wall. A single pronouncement from them could reshape the way a kingdom conducted its rituals, managed its harvest, or even chose its next ruler. They were the guardians of the sacred order, Dharma, in a world growing increasingly complex. From this concentrated spiritual influence, an invisible empire of the spirit emerged. It had no fixed borders, yet it stretched across all centers of power. It had no armies, yet it could coordinate kings. It needed no war, yet it could shape politics and commerce. It functioned like a vast, unseen network, with faith, ritual, and knowledge as its lifeblood. In ancient memory, this was the time when the grandest ceremonies, all-night chants beneath starry skies, gathered kings from faraway lands. These rituals were not merely religious acts, they were sophisticated social mechanisms. When kings sat together around a single fire, reciting the hymns of the cosmos, they briefly returned to a shared sense of unity, a sense that they were not rulers divided by borders, but pieces of a larger whole. Many modern scholars studying ancient power structures have noted this unique feature. In many pre-classical civilizations, ritual itself was a form of governance. Political power wasn't enforced through decrees, but through ceremony. This also explains why sacred language became increasingly central. In Treta Yuga, the ancient syllables, later crystallized in the Vedas, were considered keys to the layers of the cosmos. No one was allowed to alter them. A single mistake in a ritual could be seen as a break in the sacred order. This wasn't mere superstition. In a society where ritual was the axis of power, preserving the exact words meant preserving the entire spiritual structure. As a result, the early Brahmin class slowly rose into a position of immense influence, though not yet as rigidly defined as in later eras. In parallel, political power expanded softly. Large kingdoms strategically positioned along river networks began to project their influence beyond their borders. They didn't need conquest. They expanded their reach through grand rituals, compelling smaller kingdoms to participate or risk being cut off from the sacred network. This was a subtle and sophisticated form of religious political alliance that could last for centuries without a single large-scale war. During this time, the idea of a sacred capital emerged, a center where faith and power blended into one. In Indian memory, cities like Ayodhya and Dwarka are remembered not only as royal residences, but as gateways between the human and divine realms. From these centers, rituals spread across distant lands, creating spiritual unity that transcended physical boundaries. Interestingly, these sacred capitals were rarely built in harsh landscapes. They stood along rivers near fertile plains, in places where prosperity could be sustained over time. This allowed them to become hubs of trade, knowledge, and ritual, forming something remarkably close to a civilization without the need for empire. Treta Yuga, in many ways, witnessed the first seeds of imperial structure, without an actual empire. But with concentrated power, even spiritual power, came fragility. When authority rested in the hands of a few, or was anchored in specific centers, other regions began to feel dependent. When ritual became the measure of status, questions naturally followed. Who holds the right to the sacred knowledge? Who decides what is holy? And if a single chant could make a kingdom tremble, who truly ruled, the king or the keeper of the chant? This was the moment when the first fractures appeared in what seemed to be a perfect structure. They did not erupt into war, not yet, but they rumbled quietly beneath the solemn hymns of the age. Those outside the ceremonial centers began to feel the distance. Smaller kingdoms began to feel the weight of pressure. And so history turned its page toward an era where sacred unity slowly began to transform into a tool of control. The great ceremonial centers, once seen as keepers of the memory of Satya Yuga, were now becoming true seats of power. When a grand ritual was held, smaller kingdoms were expected to send envoys, tribute, and full participation to affirm their place in the order. What had once been a sacred act of unity gradually turned into a mechanism of soft control. The sacred centers began to draw a line between those inside the network and those outside, an invisible boundary that carried very real weight. The rishis, the sages and keepers of ancient knowledge, who were once revered for their spiritual connection to the divine, now held decisive power not only over rituals, but also over politics. A single word from them could grant a king legitimacy or cast him out of the cosmic order. As knowledge became a source of power, it also became a tool. The sacred chants were no longer the shared heritage of humankind. They were tightly controlled. Who could learn them? Who could perform them? Who was worthy to step into the ritual circle? All decided by a small, elite group. This hierarchy brought a quiet shift in the collective psyche. Those outside the ceremonial core began to feel distant from the divine. No longer did they speak directly to the gods as their ancestors had in Satya Yuga. Now they had to go through intermediaries, those who held the power. The sacred world, once open and boundless like the sky, was now veiled by a layer of human authority. And as the gods were placed further away, a new fear arose, fear of being forgotten, abandoned, or stripped of divine protection for failing to obey. This imbalance was felt most sharply in the lands far from the ritual centers. Smaller kingdoms, once integral parts of the sacred network, were turning into satellites orbiting the great centers of power. They depended on central rishis to tell them when to plant their crops, how to pray for rain, even to be recognized as legitimate members of the sacred world. This undermined one of Treta Yuga's earliest values, shared harmony. Faith began to fracture. In ancient legends, this era is often described through subtle but heavy imagery. People said the old chants grew quieter, the gods appeared less often, and the sacred fire burned more slowly. These are not literal descriptions, but collective impressions, a feeling of growing distance between the divine and humankind. Where once people felt presence, now they heard only echoes. Another phenomenon began to surface: religious conflict. As the major centers of spiritual authority grew in power, each developed its own rituals and interpretations of Satya Yuga's legacy. The differences were small at first: a variation in a chant, a way of kindling the fire, a ritual symbol. But over time, they became markers of identity. One kingdom no longer simply differed from another, it became its ceremonial opposite. And when ritual was tied to power, ceremonial differences became political ones. During this same period, some kings began to ask a dangerous question. If the rishis could coordinate the order of the world, then who truly ruled? As sages gained the power to make kings kneel before the sacred fire, the relationship between ruler and knowledge keeper grew tense. In India's mythic memory, there are many stories of rebellious kings, rulers who tried to reclaim equal standing with the sacred centers. These were the first rumblings of a volcano that had not yet erupted. What made this period especially fragile was that none of these conflicts surfaced openly. Everything remained cloaked in sacred ceremony. The rituals continued, envoys still arrived for festivals, the sacred fires were still lit beneath the full moon. But beneath this solemn surface, cracks spread like thin fissures in spring ice, not yet strong enough to break it apart, but impossible to undo. When a system of power grows too rigid, cracks inevitably begin to form from within. By the end of Treta Yuga, the quiet embers of tension that had long smoldered beneath the surface began to glow. Ceremonial centers that once symbolized unity were now becoming collision points of power, and kingdoms that had once orbited faithfully around them began to drift away. This was not a violent rebellion, but a quiet withdrawal, a slow, deep shift beneath the surface. The rishis, the keepers of sacred language and ancient knowledge, once seen as guiding lights, were now viewed differently. The kings, by then accustomed to real political power, began to understand that spiritual authority could both strengthen and strangle a kingdom. A single denied ritual or a pronouncement from the sacred centers could strip a king of his legitimacy across the entire network. And when a king lost legitimacy, it was not just his throne that wavered. His entire realm was cast out of cosmic order. It was at this moment that some kings began building their own ceremonial centers. At first, they still participated in the common rituals, but alongside them they raised their own temples, gathering independent rishis or local faith groups. This was a quiet but decisive turning point. When the divine could be honored in multiple places, the old center's monopoly on ritual began to weaken. When sacred fires could burn in more than one kingdom, the once unified sacred order began to tremble. Meanwhile, new groups began to appear. Those later remembered in legend by many names, the wanderers of the rivers, those who belonged to no temple. They were prophets, pilgrims, believers who carried ancient memories without bowing to the established structure. To the central powers, they were a threat, keepers of memory outside official control. But to distant communities, they were voices of freedom, storytellers of Satya Yuga unbound by ritual orthodoxy. The gap between center and periphery widened. Far from the great rivers, where the influence of central rituals was weaker, people began to return to local folk faiths tied to forests, mountains, winds, and ancestral spirits. They still remembered the old gods, but with their own names and rites. And this was not a break, but a divergence, a once unified sacred network, slowly branching into many streams. This shift directly affected political alliances. Without shared rituals as a bridge, kingdoms no longer had a deep reason to remain tightly bound. Small conflicts began to flare over resources, especially water and fertile land. What had once been resolved through chants and ceremony now had to be settled with spears and political bargains. The shadow of the first true wars began to sweep across this age. In many ancient legends, this is described as the time when the gods stepped back once more. This phrase was more than theology. It reflected a profound psychological reality. People no longer felt the same shared divine protection. Each kingdom began to call upon the gods in its own way, to worship in its own language. When the divine was no longer one, humanity was no longer one. A multipolar and conflicted world was emerging. Another striking phenomenon arose: the politicization of ritual. In the early Treta Yuga, rituals were sacred acts to maintain harmony. But once power became embedded in them, grand ceremonies transformed into displays of strength. The king who held the grandest festival, who gathered the most envoys, the most rishis, the brightest sacred fire, became the most powerful ruler. And as ritual became a soft weapon, it also became a battleground between great centers. The rishis themselves were no longer united. Some remained loyal to the central network, while others went independent, aligning with local kings or emerging movements. Debates over true versus false ritual grew louder. Questions like who holds the sacred fire, who declares the sacred hour, who interprets the chant, turned from theological disputes into matters of power. But the most dangerous fracture was not in ritual itself, it was in collective faith. A ritual draws its strength from shared belief. When that belief fragments, the ritual loses its unifying force. Each kingdom clung to its own truth. As chants no longer resonated in unison across the land, the world lost more than unity. It lost a piece of its shared soul. To the ancient Indians, this time was remembered in quiet, mournful words. The gods no longer sit together. Each person tends their own flame. It was a warning. When the sacred fire is divided, when memory is no longer shared, when the network of the divine shatters into fragments, the world steps into a new chapter, a chapter of division, a chapter of turmoil, a chapter of twilight. The world of Treta Yuga had once been a unified web of rituals, rivers, sacred knowledge and memory. But by the end of this age, the threads that had once bound kingdoms together began to loosen. Not with the noise of war, but like cracks spreading quietly across a frozen lake. When the great sacred centers no longer held unquestioned authority, a multipolar and unstable world emerged. Power was no longer concentrated solely in the hands of the old ceremonial hubs. Beside them, new forces began to rise, kingdoms strong enough to host their own rituals, independent lineages of rishis, and thriving local faith groups outside the official network. Each had its own way of remembering Satya Yuga, its own myths, its own rituals, and its own symbols. And when a single shared memory fractured, it ceased to be an absolute truth, becoming instead a field of many parallel truths. This was a time when human consciousness of power changed profoundly. In earlier days, the gods had been the center, and humankind revolved around them. But now, rulers and elites realized they could place themselves at the center, as long as they were strong enough to control ritual and gather belief around them. What was once a spiritual language of harmony slowly turned into a soft weapon of power. The larger and more magnificent a kingdom's ceremony, the more envoys it drew, and the greater its political prestige grew. Faith and power became two sides of the same coin. This polarization gave rise to independent city-states. Each had its own guardian deity, its own ritual system, and its own origin story. The great ceremonial centers were no longer unique. they became just one of many competing poles of influence. What had once been a soft and seamless network now looked like a mosaic of fragments, pieces that no longer fit together as they once had. In many later hymns and legends, this era is described as the age of mighty kings, but behind the gleam of power lay a far more complex reality. These kings were no longer merely guardians of faith, they were shaping faith itself. Myth became a political tool. Ancient stories of gods and the Golden Age splintered into countless versions, each crafted to serve a kingdom's own authority. The same god could wear different names, faces, and meanings depending on where the story was told. During this time, many rishis and smaller spiritual groups began breaking away from the orthodox network, forming independent schools of thought. Some aligned themselves with local kings, becoming instruments of power. Others withdrew into forests and mountains, keeping fragments of old memory alive on their own terms, refusing to be pulled into political tides. In ancient stories, they are remembered as hermits, forest sages, or keepers of the flame, scattered pieces of Satya Yuga's memory that survived outside any central control. The rise of multiple power centers brought not only competition, but also conflict. At first, these clashes were symbolic, debates over ritual forms, sacred chants, or festival dates. But over time, these symbolic disputes evolved into political tensions. When one kingdom refused to acknowledge another's ceremony, it wasn't just a theological disagreement, it was a denial of power. From there, war was no longer unimaginable. Another sign of this shifting world was the growing sense that the gods were withdrawing from human life. In Satya Yuga, the gods had walked beside humankind. In early Treta Yuga, they lingered behind rituals, but by the end of the age, many legends spoke of gods leaving the world or hiding behind the veil. This reflected a deeper spiritual truth. Shared faith was fading. When every region called the gods by different names and invoked them in different ways, the divine no longer felt like one shared presence, but like scattered shards of what had once been whole. As collective belief weakened, another change took hold: the rise of monumental temple building. When people no longer felt the presence of gods, they tried to anchor that presence in stone, gold, and towering structures. Temples grew larger, more elaborate, more symbolic. But in doing so, faith shifted from something alive and shared to something architectural. Grand monuments that could not replace a living sacred memory. A once unified network had become a shattered mirror. Each shard reflected a fragment of memory, a fragment of myth, a fragment of power. And when the reflections no longer formed a single image, the world entered a twilight age. An age of division, simmering conflicts, and the gathering storms of war. Many modern scholars, when reading ancient texts, have recognized this transition not as a sudden collapse but as a long, slow sunset. But when night finally falls, it rarely does so gently. Once shared faith dissolves, a new cycle begins. A world of rival powers colliding not only through rituals, but through authority, ambition, and war. The collapse of an era does not always sound like thunder tearing through the sky. More often, it begins with quiet noises, the faint crack of something underfoot, the whispers no longer spoken in unison, the sigh of old temples left untended. By the end of Treta Yuga and the dawn of Dvapara Yuga, the ancient Indian world was no longer a single woven network, but a stretched fabric, ready to tear into pieces. And once the first thread snapped, the whole structure could no longer hold. This fracture was most visible in the realm of ritual order, the foundation that had upheld unity for millennia. Grand ceremonies that had once gathered kings and rishis in shared reverence were now stages for displaying power. Each kingdom held its own festivals, recited its own chants, chose its own dates. The envoys who once came to honor a common order now arrived to quietly assert their own strength. As the sacred hymns lost their shared rhythm, the ritual flames ceased to burn in harmony. This was also the time when political religious alliances began to dissolve rapidly. In earlier days, a unified network of rituals had allowed smaller kingdoms to survive by anchoring themselves to the great ceremonial centers. But as those very centers turned into competing forces, the satellites were forced to choose sides or struggle for independence. This loose, unstable web created a world full of volatility and danger, a world with no single authority strong enough to coordinate or ease the growing tensions. Many ancient legends call this period the time of divided flames. Instead of one great fire blazing in the night, there were now hundreds of smaller fires scattered across the land. Each flame was a center of power, a faith network, a circle of loyal kings and rishis. When these flames burned at once, their light did not blend. It clashed, creating shadows deeper than before. This image perfectly captures how shared faith fragmented and how, in the absence of a single spiritual center, people no longer felt the protection of the gods as they once had. The rise of warrior kings was another defining mark of early Dvapara Yuga. In Satya Yuga, the rishis had been the spiritual core. In Treta Yuga, rituals had guided and coordinated the world. But in Dvapara Yuga, military strength became the true measure of power. Kings no longer wished to stand behind the sacred fire. They wanted to control it. They wanted to define the rituals, choose who performed them, and decide which mythology would be considered official. Once spiritual authority became worldly, rituals stopped being the glue of harmony and turned into instruments of control. A striking phenomenon emerged during this period: two parallel worlds. On one side stood the old temple networks, losing their influence and trust. On the other, new political and military powers rose, hungry for dominance. Conservative rishis tried to hold on to the past, performing rituals the old way, but with every attempt the gap between them and the ruling class widened. Meanwhile, young kings, raised in an atmosphere of fragmentation, saw rituals not as sacred ends but as tools. Myth was no longer a living truth but a political weapon. The clash between these two worlds did not erupt into full-scale war immediately, but it cut deep. Many regions once loyal to the great ceremonial centers turned away. Many rishis abandoned the temples, either retreating into seclusion or aligning themselves with new powers. Smaller kingdoms were absorbed into the expanding domains of rising forces. The map of power began to shift quickly, like a calm river surface suddenly breaking into turbulent currents. In later mythic texts, this period is often described as a time of moral decline. But beneath that phrase lies not simply the decay of personal ethics, it is the transformation of a collective value system. When rituals lost their sacredness and myths splintered, the moral structures that once bound people together could no longer hold. What had once been blasphemy became strategy. What had once been sacred became something to be seized. At the same time, many groups left the old centers, migrating into forests, mountains, and coastal lands. This marked the first great dispersal of people during this turbulent era. These communities carried their own fragments of memory, their own rituals, symbols, and myths. Over time, these fragments became distinct local traditions, slowly detaching from the old structure. Many of these traditions would later form the roots of new religions and philosophies in the post-flood world. Beneath all of this lay a deep, collective unease. Legends from the time speak of a heavier sky, unpredictable seasons, and gods who spoke less. These ancient words may be the echoes of real shifts, signs of both political and environmental upheaval. The imbalance did not come only from human conflicts, it came from the earth itself, as if the world was moving beneath the surface, preparing for a new and turbulent age. The early Dvapara Yuga was therefore not only an age of politics and war, it was an age of lost faith. When the shared myths no longer shone as a single lantern, people turned to their own small flames. And when every flame burned in a different direction, the night grew longer, deeper, and colder. No night ever descends because of a single gust of wind. It begins with a small crack in the sky, and then it spreads, widening into a storm that swallows all light. By the end of the early Dvapara Yuga, those cracks were everywhere. The world of the ancient kingdoms, once held tightly together by a unified web of ritual and belief, had unraveled into a chaotic chessboard where power, faith, military force, and ambition coiled around one another like deep, unseen currents. One of the most striking features of this time was the rise of great river empires. As smaller kingdoms splintered, a few strategic centers, places where rivers converged, fertile lands stretched wide, or ancient trade routes crossed, began to expand rapidly. The rulers of these centers not only commanded strong armies but also sought to control grand rituals to legitimize their authority. For them, ritual was no longer a sacred hymn, it was a stage to display power. Ancient mythic accounts describe vast festivals held along the riverbanks. Thousands of torches lit the night. Ritual flames rose as tall as a man. Chants echoed for nights on end. But unlike in Treta Yuga, when such ceremonies symbolized unity, they now became emblems of domination. When a king hosted such a ceremony, it wasn't only his people who attended. Emissaries from weaker kingdoms were compelled to bow their heads as well. A single great fire now stood for a single great power. Once ritual turned into a political tool, war became inevitable. The earliest ceremonial conflicts did not begin with blades but with refusal. A king declined to recognize another's ritual, refused to send envoys, refused to recite the hymns as dictated. And in a world where ritual measured power, such refusal was no less than a declaration of war. The first confrontations flared around the great temples, places that had once been the heart of unity, now transformed into battlegrounds. These wars were not only about land, they were battles to define mythology itself. The victor gained the power to impose their ritual upon the defeated. The hymns, the symbols, even the names of the gods were reshaped to serve the will of those who conquered. This was one of the most profound turning points of the pre-flood era. Mythology, once sacred memory, was now a weapon of power. Meanwhile, military might reached unprecedented heights. The first true empires emerged from these fertile, strategic heartlands. They built disciplined armies, skilled in both attack and defense, trained to use weather, rivers, and terrain as tools of war. In surviving oral traditions, people spoke of armies before whom the heavens and earth trembled, not as literal divine events, but as a way to describe the overwhelming scale and force of their campaigns. Short-lived alliances also began to form. Smaller kingdoms, trying to avoid being consumed, joined forces or submitted to the rising empires. But without the shared ritual order that had once unified the world during Treta Yuga, these alliances rarely lasted. Some endured only a few generations, others just a few seasons of war. Where once faith had been the cement of unity, now there was only interest. And interest, by nature, is fragile. Another telling phenomenon was the shifting role of the rishis. This class, once the soul of ritual life, no longer stood as one. Some served the new empires, using ancient knowledge to legitimize royal authority. Some withdrew into forests and mountains, guarding fragments of the old memory like buried treasure. Others became wanderers, storytellers carrying different versions of ancient myths from land to land. It was through these wandering voices that the memories of Satya Yuga and Treta Yuga survived, splintered into countless variations. But behind the brilliance of these rising empires grew ever-lengthening shadows. As power concentrated, regions on the margins became impoverished, rivers thinned from overuse, forests were cut to feed armies and fields, cities rose high, but with them came disease, unrest, and deepening inequality. The world that had once moved in rhythm with nature was now stretched and strained by human hands. The people of that time must have felt it, not through records or theories, but as a quiet, growing unease. Legends from Dvapara Yuga speak of skies turning to bronze, longer nights, and thunder in the dry season. These ancient words may be echoes of environmental shifts, climate instability, and social tremors all unfolding at once. It felt as if a great wave was gathering just beyond the horizon. The irony of this age was that the world stood at its brightest just before the break. The grandest festivals, the mightiest armies, the most thriving cities, all appeared at the peak right before the great night fell. History repeats this pattern again and again. The light burns brightest in the moment before it goes out. By this time, the ancient world was no longer a scattering of small river kingdoms. It had become a vast and intricate web of power, a network where ritual, military strength, trade, and fragile political alliances between rising empires intertwined like converging currents beneath a calm surface. Dvapara Yuga was not only an age of division and conflict, it was also the peak of pre-flood civilization. This was the moment when humanity, with its faith already fractured, poured all its energy into expanding its own power, and in doing so, created a system unlike anything before. The great river empires along the Sarasvati River, Indus River, and the southern coasts of ancient India became centers of prosperity unmatched by earlier ages. These civilizations built monumental stone cities, expanded irrigation and large-scale agriculture, and developed sprawling trade networks that stretched for thousands of miles. The old ritual pathways of Treta Yuga had turned into strategic trade routes. Boats, wagons, and caravans moved day and night, carrying gold, gems, wheat, spices, raw iron, copper, and sacred offerings. With thriving commerce came concentrated wealth. Grand markets sprang up near river ports where goods from distant lands were exchanged for the exquisite crafts of the urban centers. People forged metal, carved precious stones, and built statues, temples, and fortresses, not only to worship the gods but to display power. Material symbols now replaced the invisible sacred signs of earlier eras. The divine was no longer only felt in rituals, it was forged into massive statues draped in gold, silver, and gemstones. Whenever an empire reaches material greatness, it also creates an illusion of permanence. Cities like Dwarka, described in ancient texts, shone so brightly that people believed their light would never fade. Yet history often hides its first cracks beneath its brightest moments. Prosperity created distant ruling classes, fractured social hierarchies, and sprawling networks of power that became increasingly difficult to control. Imperial alliances emerged on a scale never seen before. These were no longer simple ceremonial bonds, they were political, economic, and military pacts. Empires exchanged goods, weapons, agricultural technology, military strategies, and even rituals to serve political goals. Coastal and riverine routes became the lifelines of the ancient economy. For the first time in pre-flood history, the world stretched across continents in a web of interconnection. But beneath that brilliant surface, something quieter and unstoppable was unfolding. Nature itself was shifting. Ancient texts and oral traditions began to speak of rainy seasons that no longer came on time, rivers changing their course, and strange tastes in the sea winds. Beneath the poetic words, modern scholars have found traces of real climatic changes, shifting river systems, drought, rising sea levels. For civilizations that depended entirely on water, for rituals, agriculture, and life itself, these changes were the first ringing bells of an approaching storm. But instead of adapting, the empires reacted with the instinct of power. Expand and control more. When one river dried, they marched their armies to seize another. When floods came, they built higher walls and larger dams. When nature fell out of rhythm, they intensified their rituals, believing that sacred chants could hold back the tides beneath the earth. It was during this time that stories of strange signs in the sky began to spread. People spoke of stars shifting, light shimmering like water, and fiery objects falling into the sea. These were likely ancient ways of describing celestial or geological events. Slow atmospheric changes, meteor showers, or other natural phenomena. But the physical explanation matters less than what people felt. They knew their world was no longer the same. And when people feel that time is changing, two reactions always follow. One side tightens its grip, empires enforce stricter control, intensify rituals, raise taxes, and guard water sources fiercely. The other side pulls away. Small communities, wandering rishis, free believers who still held the memory of Satya Yuga and Treta Yuga retreated from the imperial centers. They went deep into forests, mountains, and coastal frontiers, creating scattered memory zones beyond the empire's reach. Gradually, these two worlds drifted apart. One believed in the power of empire, in gold, temples, and armies. The other clung to ancient memory, cycles of the cosmos, and the whisper of prophecies. And in the space between these two worlds, something immense was building, like a wave beneath the ocean, unseen but powerful enough to reshape everything when it rose. The pre-flood empires did not know they were standing on the edge of a precipice. All they saw was their wealth, their power, their belief that they could command even the forces of nature. They did not see what history had already shown many times before, that the silence of the earth often comes just before the roar. In every cycle of civilization, there is a moment when everything seems to stand still, as if history itself pauses, letting humanity believe it has reached eternity. For the pre-flood world, that moment was the height of Dvapara Yuga. The great empires of the time did not merely command the land and rivers, they stretched their reach out to the sea, linking distant lands with maritime trade routes that spanned thousands of miles, from the warm waters of the Indian Gulf to faraway places that now linger only in legend. Maritime trade became a constant presence. Large ships carved with exquisite detail, with tall masts and wide hulls, carried gold, copper, turquoise, sandalwood, spices, resins, semi-precious stones, pearls, and sacred artifacts. They sailed eastward along the southern coast of ancient India, then circled westward, stitching together the edges of the known world. These routes carried more than goods. They carried ideas, rituals, mythologies, and ways of seeing the universe. What emerged was an intercontinental trading world, not written on paper or fixed by borders, but built upon soft alliances, shared temples, ritual exchanges, political marriages, and unspoken pacts between rulers. Distant kingdoms began to imitate the architecture, clothing, and symbols of powerful centers. God statues, ornamental motifs, and ritual chants flowed like invisible currents across oceans. For the first time, pre-flood civilizations blended and intertwined, creating a cultural mosaic richer and more complex than anything before. Yet even within this brilliance, the first fractures appeared. Hairline cracks, sharp like lines in glass. As commerce expanded, Wealth concentrated more intensely in the hands of a ruling few. Prosperous port cities became new centers of power where merchant aristocrats and political elites intertwined their interests. Meanwhile, lands far from the center were stripped of their resources, drained by war and taxes. The price of light was a deepening shadow. At this peak of power, ritual itself reached an unprecedented scale. Seasonal festivals, sacrificial offerings, and great religious ceremonies gathered tens of thousands of people and lasted for days. Hundreds of fires blazed on riverbanks, thousands of priests sang into the night, and envoys came from distant kingdoms. But unlike the rituals of Treta Yuga, where unity of spirit lay at the heart, these rituals had become political theaters. The kingdom with the grandest ceremony, the tallest flames, and the most bowed heads became the new center of the world. When rituals no longer unite but divide, they cut deeper than war. Weaker kingdoms were forced to pay tribute just to buy their place within the global trade ritual network. Those who resisted were isolated or attacked. The great empires grew into vast engines, swallowing everything around them: resources, cultures, faiths, people. In oral traditions that survived, this age was remembered as a time when the earth grew heavy and the gods fell silent. This was more than politics. It became a collective feeling. Ordinary people in distant city-states began to sense the unease, not because a great war had already erupted, but because everything felt too large, too fast, too fragile. Rivers shifted their flow. Sea levels rose, slowly but clearly, along the coasts. Fertile lands faced unexpected floods, while others turned dry. An entire system built on the belief that humanity could control nature was beginning to feel nature push back. In ancient Indian legends, this is the age when omens filled the sky, nights that shone too brightly, stars that moved, fiery trails falling into the sea, crops refusing to obey prayers. These signs were not supernatural portents, but ancient ways of describing geological and climatic changes building beneath the surface. Tremors that would become a wave of destruction within a few generations. Amid this, some groups felt what was coming. They did not believe in the empire's immortality. They took with them ritual carvings, sacred symbols, and ancient knowledge, leaving the centers of trade and power behind. They fled to the high mountains, deep caves, and untouched forests. These were the memory keepers, the last rishis still breathing the air of Satya Yuga and Treta Yuga. They did not fight the empires. They simply walked away, as if they already knew what awaited. The great empires, on the other hand, continued to expand. The more nature shifted, the tighter their grip became. More rituals, more armies, more ships, more gold. They built magnificent cities on land that was already trembling, unaware that history had seen this pattern before, and that the quiet before the roar is never truly silent. No empire collapses in a single bad day. History always begins with small shifts. A river running lower than usual, a late monsoon, a season of winds that suddenly changes direction. By the end of the peak of Dvapara Yuga, those small shifts were already spreading across the ancient world. Every river, every aquifer, every monsoon, forces that people once believed they had mastered, began to act in ways no one could predict. In many regions, the flow of water no longer followed its old rhythm. The once fertile lands along the Sarasvati River and Indus River endured long stretches of drought, broken by sudden and destructive floods. Along the coasts, once bustling centers of commerce, the sea began to rise. Ancient harbors, river settlements, and rich farmlands slowly disappeared beneath the creeping water. To those who lived through it, this wasn't climate change. These were omens, signs that the heavens were shifting. At first, the empires responded as great civilizations always do by tightening control. They built more dams, dug more canals, stationed troops to guard critical waterways. But as water grew unpredictable, it became the ultimate power. Whoever controlled the water controlled life itself. And so the first water conflicts erupted. At the beginning, they were small disputes between villages and city-states, but as rivers changed their course and water grew scarce, those disputes expanded into full wars between empires. Every great power had built its prosperity upon a water pillar, a river, a delta, or a coastal plain. When those pillars trembled, the entire structure shook. Armies no longer existed just to protect their land. They marched to claim the flow, to fight for survival itself. At the same time, another phenomenon was unfolding: climate shifts across entire regions. In ancient legends, this period was described in symbols: winds rising from places where there was no wind, the sea sighing like a beast, the sky glowing when there was no moon. These words likely reflected large-scale environmental disruptions, changing monsoon patterns, rising sea levels, distant volcanic activity, or geological disturbances that rippled across continents. For a civilization built entirely upon natural rhythms, a single disruption was enough to set off chain reactions lasting generations. As water grew scarce, society stratified further. The wealthy and powerful, concentrated in imperial cores, still enjoyed the security of canals, dams, and granaries. But the poor and the outer regions suffered the full force of collapse. Crops failed, lands dried up, homes were lost, families were forced to move. Waves of migration spread toward the mountains, forests, and the last remaining dry coasts, carrying with them a rising storm of social tension. For the ruling classes, this was the age when ritual was pushed to its absolute limit. When nature no longer obeyed, they believed the only solution was to make their rituals louder, larger, grander, to call the heavens back. Tens of thousands of laborers were forced to build temples, altars, and colossal statues. Ceremonies to call the rains lasted for months. Sacred fires blazed through the night on riverbeds that were drying into dust. But the more they chanted, the quieter the world became. The gods, in their eyes, had fallen silent. That silence spread like a shadow. In ancient tales, this was the time when humans lost their voice to the sky. It wasn't just a religious image, it was a deep psychological truth. The cosmic order that once held the world together had broken. When prayers no longer brought the rain, when gold could not buy the harvest, when temples could not hold back the water, even the mightiest empires began to understand that their power was smaller than they had ever imagined. Then came something even more frightening. The earth itself began to shift, slowly, imperceptibly, too slowly to be named, but not too slow to be felt. Legends speak of trembling ground, coastlines sinking, and thriving port cities disappearing beneath the sea. These would become the roots of countless flood myths. Stories of cities swallowed by the ocean, including Dwarka and other ancient coastal centers. While the great empires struggled against instability, the smaller communities that had long left the imperial centers began forming their own hidden networks. They lived in forests, mountains, and regions less affected by the rising waters. They had no wealth, no armies, no temples of gold, but they had something the empires had lost: the ability to adapt. They learned to live with change rather than fight against it. In time, these scattered groups would carry the memory of the pre-flood world through the era of collapse. This pre-crisis age was like a long, heavy breath. Everything on the surface seemed to continue. Rituals still held, ships still sailed, cities still gleamed. But beneath the earth, movements had already begun that could not be reversed. The question was no longer whether the storm would come, only when. When a great system of power begins to collapse, it never falls all at once. It frays from within, layer by layer, like a finely embroidered fabric tearing at many corners at the same time. The middle and late period of Dvapara Yuga was exactly such a moment. The empires that had once flourished along the rivers, stretched across the seas, and believed themselves eternal, were now trembling at their foundations. The wars over water were no longer local disputes. They had grown into regional conflicts lasting for years, pulling dozens of kingdoms and alliances into their spiral. As rivers changed course or dried up and fertile lands disappeared, the empires fell into a vicious cycle. The more they fought, the scarcer the water became, and the scarcer the water, the more they fought. No ritual could calm the anger. No single center of authority could bring everyone back to the same fire. The order that once bound them together was now little more than ash. The once familiar scenes of grand festivals, vast gatherings around sacred fires, and glittering envoys faded away. In their place came tattered armies, burning riverbanks and broken canals deliberately destroyed to keep them from the enemy's hands. Kingdoms that had once stood side by side no longer trusted each other. Fragile treaties were betrayed as quickly as they were signed, traded for a few seasons of survival. For ordinary people, this wasn't just a political crisis, it was the unraveling of daily life. Farmers who had lived on lush river plains were forced to abandon their land when the water disappeared or war swept through. They fled into forests, climbed into the mountains, or drifted toward the coasts. The once prosperous port cities filled with refugees, people with no land, no harvest, no temple left to pray to. This mass migration didn't just create a humanitarian disaster, it shook what remained of the already fragile social fabric. Empires lost their labor force, agricultural systems crumbled, merchants abandoned old harbors in search of safer routes. And as the streams of people flowed away, the bustling cities began to fall silent, like a lamp still burning, with no one left to stand around it. The ruling class responded the only way they knew how, by tightening control. But their power had already been hollowed out from within. They built bigger statues, held longer rituals, mobilized their people to raise towering temples and ceremonial altars. But no ritual brought back the rain. When the temples stood tall but the rivers ran dry, when thousands of voices chanted and the sky gave no answer, collective faith began to shatter. In ancient legends, this moment is described as the time when prayers no longer carried far. That phrase captures a profound spiritual crisis. For thousands of years, people believed the world moved in harmony with a sacred order. If they performed the rituals correctly, the gods would answer. But now that order was broken. Nature had turned cold, distant. The gods, in human memory, had withdrawn, hidden, or simply fallen silent. Once collective faith was gone, ritual lost its power as a political tool. Kings who had once used ceremonies to legitimize their rule now faced doubt from their own people. Rishis, once bridges between heaven and earth, were seen as powerless. Some threw their support behind rising military powers to hold on to their influence. Others disappeared into forests and mountains, carrying the last fragments of memory from Satya Yuga. It was a quiet disintegration of the spiritual axis that had held the world together. The cracks in the system widened, trade fractured, sea routes became dangerous, plagued by storms, piracy, and chaos. Great power centers began to isolate themselves, fortifying temples and hoarding wealth behind their walls. Meanwhile, the peripheral regions were left to decay. The once connected world had splintered into scattered fragments, with no central thread to hold them together. Extreme natural events grew more frequent. Legends spoke of endless rains, unseasonable storms, cracks in the earth, and lights falling from the sky. These were likely ancient descriptions of geological unrest, shifting tectonic plates, distant volcanic activity, coastal collapses, or meteor impacts. No one at the time understood what these signs meant. They only knew their world was changing in ways they had never seen. When a civilization falls into total crisis, it doesn't just lose political or economic control. It loses its spiritual axis, the sense that its place in the universe matters. And when meaning collapses, a society becomes more fragile than any wall or city ever could. That is the true moment of darkness, when those living through it feel not only hunger, but abandonment. In that silence, the small groups who still carried the old memories quietly withdrew farther from the collapsing centers. They did not fight. They simply left, like underground streams flowing away from a river that had run dry. These were the ones who would one day become the storytellers of the age after the great upheaval. Meanwhile, the mighty empires clung desperately to a world that no longer existed. When a single ancient tree falls, its crash echoes far. But when an entire forest collapses, there's no sound loud enough to hold it all. By the end of Dvapara Yuga, the pre-flood world entered a moment when every great structure of power began to crumble, not piece by piece, but all at once. No empire stood still in this quake. Every link in the vast chain, stretched to its limit during the Age of Glory, snapped like rotted rope in a storm. Wars over water and land grew beyond regional borders. There were no treaties anymore, no fragile alliances. Empires turned on one another, fighting to seize the last living rivers, the few remaining patches of dry land, the final stores of grain. When rivers shifted course, the victor of today could easily become tomorrow's defeated. No army could win forever in a world where nature itself had become the greatest enemy. The cities that once sparkled along the rivers, birthplaces of ritual, commerce, and belief, began to collapse. First came the coastal ports, where the sea rose faster than anyone could imagine. Harbors sank beneath the water. Salt water flooded the markets. Stone buildings cracked and fell beneath the waves. People fled inland carrying fragments of memory, carved rituals, sacred relics, ancestral totems, as if trying to hold on to the soul of a world already fading. As the ports disappeared, the web of maritime trade unraveled like smoke. Ships were abandoned. Once busy routes fell silent. Without trade, without the flow of goods, the great centers of power lost their lifeblood. And when trade stopped, war became even more brutal, because what was left could only be taken by force. At the same time, the earth itself began to show its power. Ancient legends describe this period with vivid language. The ground slithered like a serpent. The sea roared with fury. The sky burned red on moonless nights. These may be collective memories of massive earthquakes, shifting tectonic plates, volcanic eruptions, or scattered tsunamis. Nature was no longer a vague threat. It had become a living force, making every human plan meaningless. In this chaos, the old faiths collapsed completely. When the waters rose and rituals no longer worked, when temples fell, when the rishis were killed or fled, the shared faith was lost. No god stood together on a single altar anymore. Each group clung to its own shard of myth, its own fragile flame, searching for meaning in the storm. A single god might be a protector in one land, yet bear a different name and meaning elsewhere. From one unified faith system, the world fell into an age of fractured myths. As belief fragmented, so did power. Mighty empires broke apart into smaller kingdoms, and those kingdoms splintered into tribal factions. In many places, kings lost all authority. local warlords rose, seizing control of water sources, rice fields, and migration routes. The once radiant world, filled with monumental temples and stone cities, was now shrouded in the wreckage of endless war. No one was strong enough to rebuild a shared order. But the greatest danger wasn't in the wars. It was in the forces of nature that could no longer be ignored. The great rivers, especially the Sarasvati River, began to vanish from the surface or shift suddenly. Coastal waters rose quickly. Cities, temples, and power centers disappeared after only a few seasons of flooding, not burned, but swallowed whole. In the memories of survivors, this was the age when the earth broke without thunder. The last generation of rishis, keepers of ancient knowledge, were either killed in the chaos or withdrew into distant, hidden places. They became wandering storytellers carrying broken myths, fading carvings, and scattered memories of a world that had once been whole. From these fragments, post-flood civilizations would one day rebuild their sacred stories. One by one, the river empires fell like dominoes. When an empire lost its water, its dependent regions broke away. When the ports disappeared, trade collapsed across the land. When goods stopped flowing, armies starved. When armies starved, temples were abandoned, rituals ceased. When rituals ceased, faith turned to smoke. And when faith dissolved, collective memory itself scattered into the mud. All of this didn't happen in a single day, but it happened faster than anyone could imagine. Just a few generations before, people had believed they could control nature, that their empires would stand forever. Now they stood at the rising shore, watching their stone walls, sacred fires, and towering statues sink into the deep, powerless to stop it. In legend, this was the time when the sky grew heavy. It wasn't about physics, it was about spirit. When faith is pulled from people's hearts, everything grows heavier, their steps, their breath, their words. Each day passed like a quiet farewell to an age that had lived too long. No one knows the exact day the sky turned to lead. No one can point to a single moment and say, "This is when the old world ended." But for those who lived through the last years of Dvapara Yuga, the feeling was unmistakable. The earth was changing, not in fragments, but completely. It was no longer small, scattered disturbances. It was a global trembling, a great stirring of nature itself, as if the world had waited patiently long enough. What was once spoken of in whispers, strange winds, unusual rains, small quakes, now became living disasters. First came the water. It no longer rose slowly. Great tides crashed in. Relentless rains poured down for weeks. Tsunamis came roaring from the deep ocean. All at once, as if the sea itself had turned against the land. The coastal regions that had once been the beating hearts of ancient empires were swept away. Port cities, temples, statues, granaries, harbors all vanished in a single season. Along the great rivers, the Sarasvati River, the Indus River, and their many branches, the floods rose higher than anyone had ever seen. The water carried soil, trees, stones, even buildings that had stood for generations. It didn't just destroy, it erased. When the floods receded, the once sacred centers were nothing but endless swamps, with broken pillars half buried in the mud. Memory itself washed away. Within a few short years, people could no longer say exactly where those cities had been, and it wasn't just water. The ground shook. In old stories, people spoke of the earth splitting open like a beast's jaws, mountains breathing black smoke, light falling from the sky into the sea. These may have been memories of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or meteors striking the oceans and unleashing waves that traveled for hundreds of miles. When the earth shifted like that, humanity was smaller than it had ever been. No army, no temple, No ritual could stand against it. The ancient empires fell almost at the same time. When the waters rose, armies broke apart. When armies collapsed, food vanished. When food was gone, faith lost its ground. Kings died in wars or fled to the highlands with only a few loyal followers. The cities that once pulsed with life were now drowned landscapes where only the wind whispered through broken stones. In later memory, this was the long night, the moment when the light of a civilization went out quietly. The last rishis did not meet this moment with chants. They met it with silence. They understood that ritual. The thread that once tied humanity to the world no longer worked. When the sky no longer listened, when the floods erased the temples, prayers became empty sounds. Some rishis withdrew to the highlands, where scattered groups of survivors built small camps. Others disappeared with the drowned lands, leaving behind a hollow space in humanity's memory. Before the Great Collapse, the legends spoke of strange signs. People said the sky seemed lower, the night grew longer, and the stars shifted. The sea glowed as if fire burned beneath it. These may have been the ways they described strange atmospheric and celestial events. Ash in the air, changing the color of the sky, heavy clouds pressing down, distant volcanic light flickering across the horizon. But to them, these were omens, the unmistakable signs of an ending. The survivors fled to the mountains, the forests, the plateaus, the last dry and relatively safe places. They carried little, a few sacred objects, fragments of stone carvings, bits of remembered knowledge. The golden empires of the old world were gone. What remained were scattered, frightened people moving through disaster with no leaders, no temples, no shared order. Their world had lost its shape. There were no central temples, no kings to follow, no grand rituals to bind them. All that was left were scattered fragments of memory, fragments that over time turned into myths, half-whispered stories passed from generation to generation. In the old Indian religious texts, this time was described as the end of a great cycle, the age when the gods withdrew from the world. It was not just poetry, it was a profound disconnection between humanity and the cosmos. When the ritual centers vanished and nature rose as an untamable force, people felt truly abandoned. The last memories of that time were buried beneath layers of symbol. No one could describe the exact floods anymore, but everyone remembered the great water. No one recalled the earthquakes in detail, but they told of the earth cracking and swallowing cities. No one could explain the strange skies, but they spoke of light falling from above. When history turns into legend, it is the surest sign that an age has closed. And in that long night of the great flood, there were no more chants, no messengers, no merchants, no cities humming with life. Only the sound of water, water spilling over the stone walls, water swallowing the colossal statues of forgotten gods, water carrying memory away, leaving behind a world as if nothing had ever been there at all. After a great storm, the forest becomes silent in a way that is not peaceful, but unsettling. It's the silence of a world that has lost something it can never get back. After the great flood, the ancient world fell into just such a silence, a darkness where humanity wandered through the ruins of an age they no longer even had the words to name. The river empires were gone, the colossal temples where prayers had once thundered like rolling drums now lay buried beneath mud and deep water. The towering statues of the gods peaked only with their heads above the rushing currents. Stone roads became strips of wet, sinking earth. The ritual fires were out. The chants of thousands of voices were gone. The world had slipped back into a raw, eerie emptiness that only follows the greatest collapses in human history. Scattered groups of survivors clung to life in the mountains, on high plateaus, and in distant places untouched by the flood. They had once been citizens of glorious empires, familiar with trade, agriculture, ceremony, and writing. But when the cities disappeared, so did all of it. They no longer had the rice of the river plains, the stored wealth of the temples, or the ships of the trading ports. All they had left was memory. Fragile, fragmented, easy to fade. Those memories were no longer carved in stone, they were spoken. In caves and around night fires, the elders began to tell the young about a world that once was. They spoke of cities glowing in the night, rivers that never ran dry, temples that touched the sky, and a time when gods still walked among humankind. But with no maps, no libraries, and no precise language to describe it, those memories slowly transformed into myth. That was the first shift from history to legend. When reality disappears and only words remain, truth begins to blur with emotion and symbol. A city swept away by the flood became a cursed kingdom. A collapsed temple turned into the gate to heaven that the gods sealed shut. A climatic event became the fury of the sea. Over time, what had once been fact became fragments of memory wrapped in the mist of myth. The scattering of survivors only made the stories more fractured. Each group carried a different piece of the past, and as they passed those fragments down to the next generations, they became different legends, sometimes contradicting each other, sometimes aligning only faintly. Later, when new civilizations emerged, these broken pieces of myth would meet again, like shards of an ancient pot. But they would never quite fit together the way they once did. This was also an age of rapid loss of knowledge. Sophisticated agricultural techniques vanished as the river plains were drowned. Astronomical systems once used to time rituals by the stars were forgotten as the night sky became something to fear instead of measure. Old languages were simplified. Monumental architecture gave way to wooden huts, earthen shelters, and rough stone walls. Humanity returned to a state of survival, not because people were less intelligent, but because the foundation of civilization itself had been erased. In that void, organized religion no longer existed, but faith endured. Survivors built small stone shrines on high ground, planted wooden poles pointing toward the heavens, and whispered prayers that no longer followed any formal script. They believed the gods had withdrawn but might return. One day, when the waters receded and the world calmed again. Their faith no longer burned like grand ritual fires. It glimmered like a small ember in a long, cold night. Many legends from this period speak of the keepers of memory, small groups who neither fought nor fled in panic, but tried to preserve what little knowledge remained. They may have been rishis hidden deep in the forests, scribes who saved a few stone inscriptions, or builders who remembered fragments of ancient techniques. In later stories, they became half-mythic figures, those who came from before the Great Flood. But most people had only fear, no more empires, no more temples, no more kings. The sky was darkened by dust and clouds for years. The air grew colder, harvests failed, animals migrated. Small groups of survivors were isolated, barely able to reach one another. History itself had been nearly wiped clean, and slowly, in a way that could not be reversed, the memory of a once great civilization turned into legends of a lost golden age, a time when humans lived in harmony with the gods, when rivers never ran dry, when earth and sky touched, when empires needed no walls because nature itself was their ally. And then it was all swallowed by the water. The world after the flood no longer shone with the light of a united empire. It was a scattered, fragile mosaic, a broken mirror of memory. Stories became lullabies, and lullabies became the only doorway connecting humanity to a past long buried beneath the tides. After years of silence, fear, and disorientation, the world began to stir again, not with the blinding light of empires, not with the return of towering temples, but with tiny sparks, small fires kindled deep in the forests and high in the mountains, where the survivors had hidden through the long night that had fallen over the earth. No one remembered the old order clearly anymore. The great cities were long gone, the mighty empires survived only in fragments of stories. Yet humanity carries a strange instinct. After losing everything, it begins to rebuild. First came rough shelters, then stone huts, then small villages. These new settlements no longer reached for the wide river plains or distant seas. They were humble, close to small streams, fertile patches of soil, and protective trees. In these first post-flood communities, the old memories didn't vanish completely. They were rewoven into simpler forms. Elders told children stories of a time when gods walked the earth, when cities shone like stars, when rivers never ran dry. The children didn't fully understand, but they felt the sacred weight of those words. From these stories, post-flood belief began to grow. At first, there were no elaborate rituals. Just a single stone chosen as an altar, a torch kept burning year-round, a stream treated as sacred. People lifted their eyes to the sky, not to demand, but to remember. They knew the gods had once been here, and believed that someday they might return. That hope became the red thread binding one generation of survivors to the next. Among them were those who remembered more, descendants of ancient rishis and others who had carried fragments of knowledge as they fled. They no longer ruled anyone. Instead, they became keepers of a fragile spiritual flame. They taught how to read the sky, how to choose land to farm, how to build homes safe from the water, how to listen to nature's shifts. And they told stories of a world greater than what anyone could now imagine. They planted in people's hearts the idea of a golden age that once was. Many religious traditions that appeared centuries later still carry echoes of these memories, of a flourishing age before the flood, of a divine era when gods walked with humankind, of a sacred river flowing through ancestral lands, of a promise that one day the old order would return. These weren't random inventions, they were the legacy of memory carried by survivors, repeated through generations until they became part of humanity's collective myth. As faith slowly returned, so did material life. When the waters withdrew, new fertile lands appeared, not vast plains, but narrow valleys, young riverbanks, and fresh alluvial fields. People learned to farm again, not with grand irrigation systems, but with their hands. The few seeds they had carried or rediscovered became the lifeblood of these small communities. In those early years, everything was fragile. A single storm could wash away a village. A single drought could scatter a tribe. But within that fragility was something the old world had lost at its peak, a direct bond with nature. No longer trying to control great rivers, people learned to live gently with hills, streams, and rain. These were the first roots of post-flood civilization. Small, but resilient. During this time, language and symbols also began to take shape again. As old memories faded, people created new words and new images to describe their world. In ancient carvings found in archaeological sites, we don't see empires. We see skies, water, and distant gods, early efforts to keep alive a link between the living and the past they had lost. To those who lived after the flood, the past was like a lantern hung high, lighting their path but forever out of reach. They no longer dreamed of rebuilding vast empires. They simply wanted to survive. Yet within their small, fragile communities, the seeds of new civilizations were quietly being sown. Seeds carrying the faint silhouette of a world that once burned bright. And it was from these scattered survivors that the great myths of the ancient world would eventually emerge, evolving into the religions, epics, and cultural identities of future civilizations. They did not know it then, but they, those who lived on the edge of ruin, would become the ancestors of the entire post-flood world. In the beginning, the small communities that had survived existed almost entirely apart from one another. Each carried its own story, its own fractured memory of the age that had been lost. One group remembered the temples along the river. Another spoke of a sunken city. A third told of gods who once rode upon beams of light. The world then was like a shattered mirror, fragments of memory scattered everywhere, no longer reflecting a complete image. But because of that, something extraordinary happened when these groups began to meet again. The memories began to fit together. The first encounters didn't happen on fertile plains, but at the edges of streams, at lake shores, wherever fresh water still flowed. At first, they were cautious. One group had ancient rice grains, another carried millet. Others brought herbs, animal skins, stone tools. There were no kings, no laws, only the need to survive. And so the earliest form of trade emerged, not with coins, but through the exchange of food, seeds, and stories. The first thing humans traded after the flood wasn't gold or silver, it was trust and fragments of memory. Through these exchanges, old stories began to travel again. One group spoke of the great waters, another of the cities swallowed by the sea, another of the gods who turned away. When these stories met, people realized something powerful. They were not alone. Each of them had once belonged to a greater age, even if they only carried a small shard of it. From this shared sense of loss and memory, the first spiritual threads of the post-flood world began to form. These sacred places were not temples of stone, but simple things, a rock set at a crossroads, a fire kept burning through the night, a place where everyone looked up at the sky together. Yet from these small points, communities began to grow. When two groups met to offer prayers to the gods who had left, they also built homes nearby, shared drinking water, shared seeds. Faith became the first glue, binding scattered survivors into something larger. As groups connected, knowledge also returned. One group remembered how to read the stars to predict the rains. Another recalled how to build embankments to hold back water. Another preserved the craft of pottery and stonework. Living together, these pieces of ancient skill merged, becoming the foundation of new forms of society. The first simple tools of the New Age were born from cooperation, not to conquer, but to endure. In many ancient Indian traditions, this period is remembered as the time of the walkers, an age without kings or empires, only wandering bands that met and parted, then met again. But it was this quiet movement that carved the first trails through the land, trails that, in time, would become the vast trade networks of future civilizations. Another remarkable thing emerged during this time: the first spiritual centers. When certain places became common gathering points because they had water, good soil, or strong mythic significance, people began to build simple stone markers around them. Not to display power, but to mark memory. These places would one day become sacred sites where legend and reality intertwined. For example, many later traditions in the Indian subcontinent speak of places where the gods returned after the Great Flood. Even if their exact locations can't be proven, the traces of these early gathering points remain as the seeds of post-flood communities, places where stone pillars and wooden posts were raised long before temples ever stood. As trade spread wider, shared signs also began to appear. People carved lines into stone, drew suns and moons and flowing rivers, a common sacred language, even among those who spoke in different tongues. From these markings, the earliest pre-religious symbols were born. Simple, intuitive, yet powerful enough to connect strangers through shared memory. When humanity had finally regained some fragile sense of stability after the cataclysm, when clay houses and evening hearth fires had become part of everyday life, a new question quietly rose in the human mind. Who will lead us now? There were no kings anymore, no grand palaces, no thrones. But in every small group there were always a few who stood out, those who were stronger, wiser, or simply trusted more than the rest. They were the first to step forward and help organize life again, not as emperors or rulers, but as guides, the keepers of water, the tenders of fire, the guardians of memory. And from them, the earliest roots of post-flood power began to sprout. In the beginning, power was not about domination, it was about trust. Those who had survived the harshest years were the ones people listened to. Those who could read the signs of rain, choose fertile soil, or read the stars were believed to have the eyes of the gods. In this age, power and spirituality were intertwined. Leaders didn't just guide the work, they performed rituals, told stories, and prayed. In the eyes of their people, they weren't just survivors. They were living links between the present world and the sacred past. Meanwhile, the memory of the pre-flood age was slowly being reshaped. No one remembered the names of the empires, the kings who ruled them, or the exact locations of the cities. But the rishis and storytellers transformed history into myth, a kind of safe language to preserve truths without needing physical proof. In their stories, kings became gods, empires became heavenly realms, and natural disasters were remembered as wars between light and shadow. Once memory became sacred, it became the spiritual foundation of a new order. Early leaders began to use these myths to legitimize their roles. They claimed they were chosen by the gods or descended from those who survived the old age. Whether true or not, these stories wove an invisible thread of trust, and that trust became the first pillar of the new society. From trust, ritual returned. No more lavish offerings or stone temples, but every community had a place they considered sacred, a mound of earth, a rock shelter, an ancient tree. Simple, intimate rituals, prayers for rain, harvest blessings, farewells for the dead, were slowly woven back into life. Rituals were no longer just pleas for help. They were ways for humanity to restore order, to feel connected to a universe they believed still watched over them. As more communities grew, their connections returned too. At first it was trade, salt, rice, herbs, stones. But then it became shared belief, the same ritual, the same story of the water god, the same legend of the first ancestor. And when enough people believed in the same story across a region, a shared memory zone emerged, the first seeds of post-flood cultures. In many ancient Indian traditions, this time is remembered as the age of the demigods, people who were still human, but carried a spark of divine memory within them. They weren't gods like those of the old world, but they held the ability to connect humanity to what was lost. They were bridges between two eras, the darkness of forgetting and the dawn of rebirth. Language, during this time, quietly became a tool of power. Those who could tell stories, remember rituals, and interpret myths were the ones with the greatest influence. Storytellers, the mothers of words, wandered from village to village, repeating what they had heard. Each time they told the story, it changed a little. A detail added here, one lost there, until it became a shared legend, flexible, unified, part history, part religion, part moral guide. It was also in this era that sacred symbols began to spread: the spiral for water, the triangle for mountains, the circle for the sun. Simple, yet powerful, these symbols were a visual language of memory. Centuries later, they would become the building blocks of writing systems, from the stone carvings of the Indian subcontinent to the earliest scripts of Sumer and Egypt. Even though the great world of the past had been swallowed by water, its spirit endured. It lived not in walls or palaces, but in memory and symbol. As humanity whispered its history to the firelight, trembling and hopeful, it unknowingly laid the first stones for its second history, the rebirth of civilization. The world, after the Great Flood, did not rise with the sound of triumphant trumpets. It began with the sound of birds at dawn, singing over patches of newly dried earth. When the waters slowly receded, when low hills and young river valleys emerged, the scattered survivors took their next step forward. From wandering bands, they began to form the first permanent settlements. Gone were the days of panic and endless drifting. Now people planted crops, channeled water, built stone houses, and more importantly, looked up at the sky without fear for the first time in generations. The first thing that changed was belief. After years of divine silence, faith in the existence of the old world did not fade. It became the foundation of the new. People no longer expected the gods to appear before them, but they believed that everything they did on this land was seen from a distant realm. They raised stone pillars and carved symbols of the sun, water, and spirals, as if to tell the universe, we are still here. From this quiet rebirth, the first primitive post-flood religions emerged. There were no scriptures, no doctrines, but they carried one defining trait. Every ritual was tied to the memory of the world before. Early ceremonies were not meant to glorify gods of war or kings, but to remember the days of rising waters, the time of light, the age when gods walked the earth. Religion, at this stage, was not a system of power. It was a way to hold on to memory. These sacred centers also became the earliest political centers. The one who led the rituals was also the one who guided the community. Every major decision, when to plant, when to migrate, when to trade, was made after prayers beside a stone pillar or a sacred fire. To the people, this wasn't worldly power, it was the will of the heavens. And from this blending of faith and governance, the first seeds of early states began to grow. Among scattered villages, some grew faster than others. They tended to form around fresh water, fertile soil, and favorable crossroads, the same conditions that had once built great empires long ago. But this time, instead of a single, vast, centralized power, development happened quietly and in many places at once. These early centers didn't compete, at least not yet, but rose like scattered seeds of a new civilization. During this period, something remarkable occurred. The flood myths of the old world became official memory. As people stabilized their lives, they began to standardize their stories. The loose fireside tales of the past turned into structured myths. One group told of a god who withdrew after the flood. Another spoke of a sunken kingdom. Others remembered a hero who led them to higher ground. Gradually, these stories merged into coherent proto-epics, the earliest ancestors of organized religious mythologies. We can still trace this pattern today in ancient traditions across the world. In India, it is remembered as the stories of Satya Yuga, an age of purity and light. In Mesopotamia, it is the flood myth in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In Egypt, it is the memory of the gods who ruled before the pharaohs. Elsewhere, there are countless legends of the old world swallowed by the sea. Though languages and cultures differ, the structure of these stories is strikingly similar, like shared fragments of humanity's oldest collective memory. Within these new communities, sacred symbols became more important. A circle represented time, a wave represented water, a triangle represented the mountains, the places where survivors had lived through the flood. These symbols were carved not only into stone and wood, but also onto pottery, tools, weapons, and amulets. Each group had its own variations, but they all pointed to one shared idea: to remain connected to the past in order to endure the present. Alongside belief, trade between communities began to grow. They exchanged seeds, tools, animal hides, and stories. A mountain village might trade dried food for salt or precious seeds from a lowland settlement. And through these exchanges, their flood legends traveled too, carried by storytellers from one campfire to another. What was once the memory of one small group slowly became the shared memory of entire regions. When memory had been told long enough, when seeds had taken root on lands once drowned beneath the waters, humanity began to build something greater. This was a turning point, the moment when fragile, scattered survivor groups slowly became the foundation for new civilizations. This was no longer the age of survival, it was the age of reshaping the world. In the new river valleys, small settlements grew into early towns. Rows of stone and clay houses lined the paths. Plots of land were planned out, some for crops, some for ritual, some for gathering. Trade between neighboring groups became regular and organized. There were guides for the caravans, fixed places of exchange, and known routes. The scale was still small, but the spirit of rebuilding a larger order had begun to spread. In these early centers, the people who led were no longer just storytellers or ritual keepers. They became real leaders. Their roles extended beyond faith into organizing work, distributing water, and controlling land. These were the first true leaders of the post-flood world. No crowns of gold upon their heads, but power in their hands. At the same time, early religions were slowly systematized. The scattered rituals of many groups began to merge into shared seasonal ceremonies, aligned with cycles of the stars and the moon. The old stories of the flood, the age of the gods walking the earth, and the first heroes were shaped into spoken epics, with beginnings, climaxes, and lessons. These epics became the spiritual glue, binding together thousands who shared no bloodline into a single community. From epic and ritual, belief evolved into religion. People no longer spoke only of a local god from one village or another. They began to speak of shared gods, symbols representing collective memory. The water god, the sun god, the mountain god, these figures stretched across regions. They might be called by different names in different places, but their meanings were uncannily similar. From this shared memory, the first ancient religions began to form, rooted in environment, memory, and the rhythm of the seasons. These gods were not new creations, they were memories given faces and voices. The water god was the memory of the flood. The sun god was the memory of the light before the darkness. The mountain god was the memory of refuge when the waters rose. When memory became myth, myth became faith, and faith became the framework of society. Civilization was truly born. Alongside faith, power structures grew clearer. The ritual leader, once merely the keeper of the communal fire, became the organizer of daily life. They decided planting seasons, allocated water, and managed the flow of goods. Around them formed circles of aides, keepers of the fields, guardians of resources, guides for the paths. Centralized power reappeared, but on a smaller, more structured foundation. In some regions, sacred centers grew into early pilgrimage sites. People from distant villages traveled for days to gather, join ceremonies, hear the spoken epics, and trade goods. These sites became spiritual hubs for entire regions, like the first stones of future kingdoms. They had no walls or armies, yet their influence stretched far beyond any single village. Later legends and records would call this the Age of the Builders, when humanity raised the first stone structures after the Great Flood, not palaces, but standing stones, stone circles and altars that pointed toward the heavens. They were not just places of worship, but memory carved into the land, reminders for future generations of an age swallowed by water. This was also when language began to grow stronger again. As communities expanded, they needed clearer ways to remember and communicate. Simple carved symbols became more structured and repetitive, the first steps toward writing. And as history has shown time and again, the birth of writing marks a great threshold. When people learn to record, memory no longer drifts in the fog. It becomes history, fixed and enduring. No age lasts forever, but no memory ever truly disappears. When the post-flood centers grew into cities, when the first leaders became kings, when simple rituals turned into organized religions, the story of a lost civilization no longer lived only in fireside tales. It became woven into the very fabric of the human spirit. The survivors of the Great Flood never thought of themselves as the founders of a new age. They simply built houses, dug canals, retold old stories, and believed the heavens still watched over them. Yet from that quiet simplicity, the foundations of the great civilizations were laid. Every carved stone, every pillar of worship, every water-calling ritual was a message to the future. We were here, and we remember. The world before the flood, with its radiant riverside cities and temples now buried deep, seemed to have vanished from sight. But it was never erased from the human mind. That memory became myth. Myth became religion. Religion became faith, and from faith, the shape of future civilizations emerged. Every empire that rose afterward, Mesopotamia, India, Egypt, Greece, China, carried faint echoes of that lost age, like a distant heartbeat buried under centuries of time. We can see it in the strange way stories mirror each other across the world. A great flood that swept away the old world, a hero who led humanity through the darkness, a mountain where life began again, gods who withdrew but promised to return. No culture invented these tales from nothing. They are fragments of collective memory, whispered across hundreds of generations like a small ember glowing in the endless night. This is why every new civilization doesn't just write its future, but it continues a broken line of memory. Every temple is a reflection of temples long lost. Every god is another layer of language over an older name. Every grand ritual is a quiet answer to a question that has echoed since the beginning. What really happened before this world began? Time passes and layers of memory stack like geological strata. One covers another but never fully erases it. Religions rise, empires flourish and fall. Yet beneath all those layers of language, power and stone, humanity still whispers the same story, of an age of light, of a great flood, of a lost world, and of a promise that the gods will return. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about history isn't the splendor of empires, but the endurance of memory. Memory needs no walls to guard it, no written texts to keep it alive, no kings to enforce it. It only needs storytellers. Those who sat by the fire thousands of years ago, passing words to their children when everything else had turned to dust. Today, when we look at ruins turned to stone, when archaeologists lift layers of earth to find traces of forgotten civilizations, we're not just unearthing bricks and pottery, we're digging into the memory of our species. And it's astonishing to realize no matter how many times the world has changed, the memory of the flood and the age of the gods still lives. In every culture, every faith, every language. This is not a story of endings, it's a cycle. Civilizations are born, they rise, they reach their golden heights, and they fall, and from the ashes, a single seed of memory takes root again. That is why history is not a straight line, but a circle. Memory always finds its way back. Maybe the ancient world is gone. Maybe the empires before the flood left no texts, no records. But that doesn't matter, because within myth, within faith, within the temples and stories built long after, that world still breathes. Not in stone or timber, but in memory. And if we stay silent long enough, perhaps we too can hear the whispers of those who once stood at the rising shore, watching their world collapse and planting the first seeds of a new one. When the world falls silent, some stories still rise softly from the depths of human memory. Stories of lost cities, of gods who once walked among us, and of ancient rivers that carried the soul of a radiant age. Civilizations may crumble, temples may be swallowed by the waves, but memory, once lit, never truly disappears. It lives in the stories we tell, in the symbols we carve, and in the way we look up at the night sky. And perhaps you, listening right now, are becoming part of that journey, a keeper of a memory that refuses to fade. If you want to keep hearing the whispers of the past, subscribe and turn on the bell for new stories. New videos every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. Lunora, where history whispers beneath the stars.